Hello everyone, and welcome to the first of hopefully many videos to come. My name is Loveless, and tonight we're going to be exploring the maddening depths of the horror found within PT, otherwise known as Silent Hills, and why I find it to be a complete and total masterclass as both a horror game and a piece of marketing history, to the point I'd proclaim it to be one of the greatest horror games of all time, and one of my personal favorite games ever. In this analysis, I'll be taking a thorough look at everything possible both within and surrounding the game, with the end goal of determining how each piece of the game comes together to form a horror experience that's not only utterly bone-chilling, but organic to the point of a shocking degree of surrealism. Since this is my first video, and my first proper analysis of a video game, specifically a piece of fictional horror, I thought it might be appropriate to do a small introduction of myself, so as to help you better understand my background as a horror fanatic, and someone with a passion for video games. I won't take too much of your time here, don't worry. I simply feel it appropriate to make sure you have a proper understanding of my perspective when approaching the subject. Furthermore, it will make for easy reference material for my audience when looking to better understand my perspective and level of experience in the horror genre. To start off, I've been playing video games and watching horror movies my entire life, although my first introduction to the concept of horror in media actually comes from a piece of fiction that's neither horror nor a video game. When I was a kid, I loved dinosaurs. I thought they were just the coolest things ever, and I had an intense fascination with ancient Earth and the idea of things existing outside my ability to even assess them. My mother took notice of my love for dinosaurs and decided I was allowed to watch the cinematic masterpiece known as Jurassic Park. I think I was about 4 years old when I first watched the film, and it completely blew my mind. I was in love, I watched it all the time, and I wore the VHS the hell out. Now, as a child, I obviously didn't quite understand the context for everything that went on in the film, but I knew one thing for certain. This other living thing, completely alive and aware, could and would eat me. The idea that something could so easily just tear apart a full-grown man with complete indifference triggered a sense of unease within me. I've never liked the idea of personally engaging in violence, so to think about these living things partaking in such brutal acts of savagery in a way that was completely second nature to them had me thinking about so much more than my mother probably would have ever guessed. I think I once talked to the kid at the dig site. Why is that kid there, by the way? Whatever. Probably sums up my thoughts the best. Being gutted and eaten alive by a pack of feral creatures is a horrifying concept to try and grasp for anyone, so I guess it probably didn't help that I've always had such a morbid curiosity with the macabre. When I started learning about old-school monsters and horror like Dracula, the Wolfman, Frankenstein, and not to mention concepts like Satan and Hades from mythology, I really took my time to read about them and their literary origins. Because of this, I actually felt like I understood them better than some of the other kids. Because of that, I was much more intimidated by them. At the same time, however, I found myself genuinely fascinated by these fictional beings and wanting to learn more. To understand them quickly became a passion of mine, and it has been ever since. My mother once jokingly referred to my memory as selectively photographic because of how, even though I'd sometimes be paying so little attention to something, I couldn't recall it 2 seconds later. There were things from when I was an infant I could recall with vivid detail. The reason I bring this up is because my memory regarding my various experiences with horror are often very vivid, quite probably due to the strong range of emotions such concepts can evoke. I remember being pretty terrified by concepts I'd seen in cartoons as a child, like Courage the Cowardly Dog with King Ramses, and even Yu-Gi-Oh! Of all things. I don't think I have to explain the Ramses bit, but there was something about Pegasus stealing Grandpa's soul through a TV with his magical eyeball that kind of freaked me out. Eventually I found myself in my first true horror game experience, though. A horror experience I would remember for the rest of my life. Resident Evil 3: Nemesis. So I'd always loved me some scary stuff as a kid. It stirred a very morbid curiosity within me, so when I heard they made video games, a medium I was already quite fond of, specifically about horror and trying to make the players scared, I was immediately intrigued. Up to this point, I had already encountered some genuinely frightening moments in games, like the Re-Deads and Ocarina of Time. I even thought to myself that zombies wouldn't be so bad, because now I could be far away using my guns, and I wouldn't have to run up to them with a sword like in Ocarina of Time. Admittedly, when I first turned on Resident Evil 3 and was immediately surrounded by zombies, I was pretty frightened, but I managed to press on, albeit briefly. Then, he showed up.
Jill! Brad! We've gotta... Jill! Help! No! Brad?
I thought Nemesis would just be some big cool monster boss set piece, but no. This thing straight up murdered my boy Brad, turned to me and was like, "Bitch!" And I just stood there like, "Ah!" He then proceeded to charge at me, so I ran, made a save as quick as possible, turned the game off and said, "Nope."
So, what do I do? Do I run or do I fight?
Yeah, I'm gonna fucking run.
So there you go. That was my first experience with a horror game. Fast forward a couple of decades, and here I am just having gotten the Platinum Trophy for the Resident Evil 3 remake. By the way, when I first started drafting this, I actually had it typed as hyped for the upcoming remake of Resident Evil 3. And I just gotta say, it feels good making that edit. Anyways, over the years, I've always had a fascination with the horror genre. Not just with video games, but with film, television, literature, music. I don't know, I guess that counts.
Alright. You wanna play like that? Let's fucking go. Yeah. Come on. What's wrong? Talk about it. Come on. Come on. Come on. Get him. Woo. Woo.
Anyways, I remember my second attempt at this newfangled horror gaming being Resident Evil 2. I was still quite young, but now that Nemesis wasn't in it, I'd figured I'd be alright. I played it, got scared as hell when the zombies came through the gun store window, and persisted, but finally gave up when I first encountered William Birkin. Look, I wasn't a brave boy. For a while, I was actually too scared to play horror games. In retrospect, it was kind of hilarious. I remember seeing Resident Evil 4 for the GameCube at my local Blockbuster and thinking, hell no, those games are way too scary for me. Ironic, huh?
Stop that plane!
But eventually I found myself getting that itch, you know, where you just really need a fresh experience from some games. This was around 2007 or so. I'd played the hell out of Devil May Cry 3 and heard DMC was basically a brother series to Resident Evil. So I decided, you know what? Let's go back and check out some Resident Evil. I'd also seen the first 3 live-action movies at this point, and say what you will about them, believe me, there is a lot to say about them. The first 2, at least, were fun, schlocky, early 2000s era action romps, and I can credit them as having reignited my interest in the franchise. Anyways, I was really itching for some Resident Evil, and I was using GameFly at the time and had recently finished The Prince of Persia: The Two Thrones. Great game, by the way. Really need to revisit them again. Oh look, we're getting remakes. Yeah. So I figured I'd put Resident Evil 3 down for my next game. Of course, stupid preteen me forgot that my PS1 memory card had recently broke and I didn't have the money to replace it. So when RE3 did come in the mail, I couldn't save any of my progress when I played it. And it was a school night. What a time. The weekend was coming up though, so I spent Friday night looking at online guides and getting a real feel for the game before I finally sat down with it Saturday and beat it in one sitting. I loved it, and by the time I was done, I was itching for more. I tried other games here and there over the following year. Of course, I went back to Resi 2, and then I started trying out other games like Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem, Condemned 2 Bloodshot, Call of Cthulhu, Dark Corners of the Earth, Fatal Frame, Alone in the Dark, Fear, and even the Western Silent Hill games. Yeah, I know. Now, obviously, not all of these titles were masterpieces by any stretch, but I was usually able to find some level of enjoyment in them. Such as the strong opening act of Condemned 2, the weird fourth wall breaking antics of Eternal Darkness, the simplistic but strong Japanese horror of Fatal Frame, and hell, despite all of its flaws, and there are many, Call of Cthulhu introduced me, alongside that episode of Billy and Mandy, to the works of H.P. Lovecraft, which have become some of my favorite pieces of work in literature as a whole. Eventually, in early 2011, I came across Dead Space 2 at my local rental place and decided to go ahead and give it a shot. I'd heard great things about the Dead Space games, so I figured this was my chance to hop on board the hype train. I played through the game, and honestly, at the time, it had become my favorite horror game ever. Sure, it had a bit more action going on, but it felt more thrilling and intense, rather than just nonsensical Hollywood-style action set pieces like what you'd get from Resident Evil 4 and 5. The Dead Space franchise often gets compared to the Alien movies, with the first one being a landmark title in sci-fi horror, the second ramping up the thrills while still maintaining a strong atmosphere of survival horror, and the third one just being a complete and total disaster that's a disgrace to the franchise and all but killed it. So, for a while, as far as horror games went, excluding the third one, Dead Space had set quite the bar for me, and having revisited it again recently, going so far as to platinum Dead Space 1 and 2,
Dead Space 2! Boom, 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 boom. Hard to the fucking car!
it's a franchise I've come to hold a lot of love for. But then came that game. You know the one I'm talking about. The game that completely set the internet ablaze. Amnesia: The Dark Descent. What's funny is that my first introduction to Amnesia was a purely comical one. It was about mid-September 2011, the Let's Play trend was only just starting to gain serious traction, and a friend of mine sent me a link to a PewDiePie video of him playing a mod called The Dark Room. It was a goofy as hell video of a custom story featuring various memes from the time, including Nyan Cat, Pedo Bear, and Trollface. God, I feel old. And while I found the video pretty funny, I was pretty interested in the game itself, too. I especially took notice of the shrill sound of the chase sequences and the way puzzles were physics-based, something I'd come to appreciate thanks to Portal. Anyways, I found myself watching PewDiePie videos of this game all the time. I thought they were fun, and the game was just awesome looking. This was about a year or so before PewDiePie really exploded into popularity, having only about 53,000 subscribers at the time, if memory serves me correct. And while I understand Amnesia, and subsequently horror games in general, would kind of dissolve into Let's Play fodder for some time in the following years, I still think Amnesia itself is a phenomenal title, and Frictional did more right than most horror game developers could ever dream of doing. I mean, hell, without Amnesia, we probably wouldn't have games like PT, Resident Evil 7, Outlast, Visage, obviously Soma, Layers of Fear, Slender, and even Alien Isolation. I don't want to spend too much time talking about Amnesia, but it's such a huge, influential title that to not give it at least a mention would feel like something of a war crime. Amnesia really reignited my love for the horror genre, but it wasn't just games, I also really loved horror movies. Some of my favorite films ever include The Ring, Ju-On, Nightmare on Elm Street, The Thing, The Void, Drag Me to Hell, The Fly, and even more recently, The Color Out of Space. For the sake of throwing in some additional horror influences of note, I'm a huge fan of the works of Junji Ito, George Romero, rest his spirit, Guillermo del Toro, John Carpenter, and H.P. Lovecraft. As far as television goes, I love the first 4 seasons of The Walking Dead, as well as the first half of Season 7. I love the entirety of the TV series Hannibal, which is so incredible that I might as well make a series of videos just for it at some point in the future. Additionally, titles like The Last of Us, Call of Duty Zombies, Bloodborne, Dying Light, Fallout, Mass Effect, Death Stranding, and even Batman Arkham Asylum are worthy of some honorable mentioning. I know some of these titles aren't necessarily a part of the horror genre itself, but I still feel they need mentioning, as they usually tackle some sort of aspect of horror that's unique, or at least interesting in some way. For example, The Last of Us is Infected are a genuinely unique take on the, at that point, grossly overused undead concept, and Bloodborne is just incredible. Seriously, Bloodborne has some of the most horrifying and downright breathtaking creature design I've ever seen in fiction, and the ways it conveys cosmic horror in the classic style of H.P. Lovecraft is utterly phenomenal. Absolutely brilliant. And finally, I feel the need to give a shout out to the SCP Foundation. I couldn't really think of an appropriate way to segue into that, but screw it. SCP is damn good stuff, and I refuse not to give it the mention it deserves. My favorite, if I had to pick one, would be SCP-035. That mask is goddamn wicked. So yeah, I've been around the block when it comes to horror, but never has any piece of fiction, never has any horror experience given me the sheer terror that I have felt in that hallway in PT Silent Hills. PT is the type of game that will eventually become something of an urban legend. It's downright terrifying, vividly memorable to anyone who's played it, and yet its unavailability means that, unlike most games, not many people will ever get to experience the sheer terror of that corridor. For most pieces of media, rarity and exclusivity are often only tied to the price of admission. Gamma Attack for the Atari 2600 may be the rarest and most valuable game in existence, but anyone with the money can purchase it from the seller and expect to see it arrive in their mailbox a couple of days later. And once they do, the only real bragging rights they have are that they spent $500,000 on some plastic junk. However, for a piece of horror media, let alone one so effectively terrifying as PT, these things tend to make the experience somehow stronger. Things are more isolated and unnerving. It's an experience you can talk about, potentially even share through streaming and videos, but the only way for anyone else that you're sharing it with to really sit down and experience the game for themselves, the frustration, the fear, the confusion, is to buy a PS4 that has the game downloaded and give it a playthrough. Unlike most rare games, PT is actually worth playing and experiencing for yourself because it manages to evoke so many powerful emotions from the player, the greatest of course being fear. It's not unlike the tape from The Ring, minus the part where you die in 7 days, where it has this sinister air surrounding it that makes you think that perhaps you're getting into something you shouldn't be. I think Nakey Jakey said it best.
Yeah, PT gets its own section of the video because it is easily, like without a doubt in my mind, the most terrifying piece of media I have ever experienced. Movie, TV show, book, song, podcast, whatever. Nothing even comes close to PT. This shit is actually cursed.
Mama Jakey, you could not have been more dead on. PT itself is almost a literal ghost. Data from a game we'll never see that can still be interacted with despite its inability to be found conventionally. The fact that this thing exists in my PS4 hard drive is haunting in its own way. I'm going to be breaking this series down into a number of categories I'll be discussing in as much depth as humanly possible. Starting with an intro to PT, I'll be discussing how the game was presented to players and how it was effective in making people come together to try and solve this bizarre puzzle of a game. I suppose the primary focus will be marketing and the overall presentation, and then I'll follow with storytelling. Storytelling will be much more interpretive, and it will focus on trying to figure out what happened in the game's canon. Following that, I'll focus on the atmosphere and be specifically discussing how the superficial and mechanical facets of PT come together to frighten the players. I'll then be moving on to the puzzles, and talking about them in the order in which the player has to solve them, how they defy typical design philosophy, and why I believe that they work at a core level despite some criticisms that may come up. Following this will be a bit of fun, where I talk about the radio and analyze just what the heck is going on with that thing. And then comes what I believe to be the main course, Lisa, where I'll be spending a great deal of time talking about everything there is to say surrounding her. And believe me when I say this will be one hell of a rabbit hole. Finally, after all of that, I'll be going into post-Silent Hills and lamenting my sorrows as I discuss the legacy of PT. This will serve as my concluding piece, and I'll also take the time here to discuss future content plans. And lastly to note, throughout the series I'm going to be using videos from other channels and streamers, because I feel it's important to highlight the numerous experiences people had with this game during its brief lifetime, as well as the number of findings within it that have surfaced over the years. My primary sources will include the Super Best Friends, Soapy Warpig, Lance McDonald, and I will even occasionally reference other channels such as Nakey Jakey, as I did earlier, Girlfriend Reviews, PewDiePie, Markiplier, and perhaps a few others. Right now, I'm still kinda sorting through them, but if they do come up, I'll be sure to put them in a window of sorts and give them due credit. The last thing I want in my YouTube debut is to start any sort of drama or come off as if I'm mooching. Rest assured that if I do use someone else's content, it's only as reference to something I simply couldn't capture in my own footage, which I have several hours of, including friends playing it for the first time. So, with all of that finally laid out, I suppose now is as good a time to actually start talking about PT. Silent Hills.
204863. 204863. 204863. 204863.
Fix this damn bug before release. Cause? Question mark.
The marketing of PT was a stroke of pure genius that will likely never be replicated again. That probably sounds like a rather bold claim to the uninitiated, so allow me to start from the very beginning of this tale with the world reveal of PT.
Peggy 18.
Watch out. The gap in the door. It's a separate reality. The only me is me. Are you sure the only you is you?
This is for the players.
It was Gamescom 2014, and Hideo Kojima, against Konami's wishes, decided to present a trailer for an upcoming demo simply titled PT. Of course, at the time, nobody knew Kojima was behind this. In fact, what we saw in that brief teaser trailer was all anyone knew about the game leading up to its release in the PlayStation Store. Based on what we were given, it appeared to be yet another generic first-person indie horror game looking to capitalize on the jump-scare internet reaction trends that had become so prevalent at the time. To be 100% frank, this trailer did not look very impressive, and although I have no real citation for this, I think it's a fair assumption that a lot of people did not seem that interested in the product. Something we all know would change quite drastically when the truth was finally brought to light. Then on the 12th of August, 2014, the world of video games was changed forever. PT dropped, and it completely swept its players away. I remember being a part of the quest to solve PT, talking amongst my peers in my college dorm, and discussing whatever it was we managed to find on the internet. My roommate and I were completely floored by how impressive this demo was, and it wasn't long before we realized there was simply no way this title was put together on a shoestring budget by some no-name indie studio. On top of the foggy aesthetic and rich Japanese horror, there was this unwavering sense that there was more to this game than we initially knew. And it wasn't just my roommate and I. The internet was on fire with people trying to figure out just what the hell the deal with PT was. Then, later that very night, we got our answer from a Twitch streamer known as Soapy Warpig, whose name will now forever be a part of video game history. I doubt you are, but if you're watching this, well done, Soapy.
This is so strange. Oh, the phone's ringing! The phone's ringing! Now what?
You've been chosen.
Oh my god! Oh my god! Oh. Nice one, Mark. You win that prize. Okay. The phone rang. That was good. Now what? That was exciting, wasn't it? We're getting there. It's happening. Bathroom. Okay, bathroom. Here we go. I'm going. This is what teamwork gets us, people. It gets results. Okay. That's what happens. Maybe we should go on the next loop? Oh, that was so satisfying, like you wouldn't even believe. Oh, I feel good. Okay. I heard a door unlock. Did you? Well, it wasn't the front door. I'll try the one behind us. Make sure I look at everything first. Okay, let's get back. Maybe it was this door. I'll try this door. If not, we'll go back and go and reset the loop again. But that was great news. Oh, let's check these pictures. Are they just normal, are they? Yeah. Tree. I don't... No, it's locked. Okay, well that was good. I think that's the end of that loop, if that makes sense. Let's pop on through again. Oh, that was so satisfying. As I said, it's very strange. There's a weird sense of, like, terror and puzzling stuff at the same time. Let's just make sure we look at that, and let's go. Oh, it's pitch black! Nothing's happening.
Damn, you're such a drag.
Every day he'd eat the same kind of food, dress the same, sit in front of the same kind of game. Yeah, he was just that kind of guy. But then one day he goes and kills us all. He couldn't even be original about the way he did it. I'm not complaining. I was dying of boredom anyway. But guess what? I will be coming back, and I'm bringing my new toys with me.
Oh my gosh, we're outside. Oh my god. I think we're at the end! Oh, fucking brilliant! Oh god, I feel so good! I feel good, I feel pumped. Oh my god! Oh my god! Hideo Kojima! What? Oh my gosh! The secret's being revealed! Oh my gosh! This is brilliant! Oh my god! This is fucking crazy. What? Oh my god! Oh my god! Oh my fucking god! Oh my god! Oh my god! It is! It's Silent Hill! We did it! Oh, we did it, guys! This is fucking mental! Oh, the three of us, the four of us together. That was insane! Oh my god. Oh, that was crazy! Fox Engine! Christ almighty! Jesus. Oh god, I'm all like shaky now. That was insane. Oh, and I'm all shaky. Ah, it's brilliant! Oh, that was great!
What's important to understand about the quest to solve PT is that progress was actually going along quite fine until players found themselves on the game's final puzzle, which is so obtuse it managed to bring all progress across the internet to a screeching halt, at least for a while. To this day, nobody except Kojima and maybe a few of his designers know for a fact what the final puzzle solution truly is, step for step. However, we do understand what you generally have to do to complete it, so it's not impossible to beat by any means, but even then, no one is capable of definitively saying, this is factually how you solve the final puzzle of PT. It's something of a crapshoot where you hope to do the things accurately enough that the game deems you worthy of the reward. Every now and then when you're playing, even if you've done it a million times and you're double checking your actions using the most accurate guide possible, there is still a chance it may not work for you. Or maybe the baby's laugh will be triggered before or even after you've completed what you believe to be the particular step of the puzzle. I think this is a particularly positive reflection of the game's legacy as a whole and why it's such a brilliant piece of Japanese horror. Even though we can beat it and we know the name of the final product it was leading us towards, there are still numerous questions that will forever remain unanswered. Specifics we'll never be able to properly pin down, being subject to our mere speculation until the end of time, or until Kojima decides to spill the beans. I vividly remember playing PT with a friend of mine once, and even though both of us had done it countless times at that point, for some reason no matter what we said into the mic, Jared, Jay, Jareth, Jack, Lisa, etc., the baby just would not giggle. So he said screw it, and turned around to do another loop only to find Lisa flying towards us, causing us to scream in sheer terror. Bear in mind this was the first time we had ever seen her do that, and it was probably 2 AM on a weekday in a college dorm. To our neighbors Ken and Quinn, I truly am sorry. Hell, even more recently when I was just gathering footage for this video, when I went to do the final puzzle, something really odd occurred. I was doing the final puzzle whilst in a party chat, working under the assumption that since party chat audio was prioritized, my microphone noise wouldn't be properly processed by the game itself. Mid-conversation, all of a sudden I hear the baby laugh. I was immediately stunned. Was the game processing all noise being inputted into the PS4 system versus the game? On top of this, what did I even say to trigger the laugh? The confusion had me pondering what had just happened for the rest of the night. This demo from nearly 6 years ago was still surprising me. I think Girlfriend Reviews actually said it best.
Then, if you want to get the super secret ending that reveals the trailer for Silent Hills, you have to look up how to do it online because it's not so much a puzzle as it is a secret Illuminati handshake.
It's almost like an initiation you just have to figure out for yourself if you want to be accepted into Kojima's weird inner circle of J-horror fanboys. I'll talk more about the final puzzle later on, but the point to remember here is just how absurdly difficult it was to solve this thing. Gamers everywhere were surfing forums trying to solve the final puzzle, which was ultimately Kojima's plan. Kojima wanted a horror experience that made people scratch their chins, put on their detective caps, and come together to figure out what it all means. Kojima's known for playing with the fourth wall, if not blowing it open entirely, see Sons of Liberty.
Raiden, turn the game console off right now.
What did you say?
The mission is a failure. Cut the power right now.
What's wrong with you?
Don't worry, it's a game. It's a game just like usual.
You'll ruin your eyes playing so close to the TV.
What are you talking about?
Raiden, something happened to me last Thursday when I was driving home. I had a couple of miles to go. I looked up and saw a glowing orange object in the sky, to the east.
And PT was definitely no exception. PT is a bizarre game no matter how you look at it. For starters, when you boot the game up, there's no main menu. Even with demos, that kind of practice is pretty uncommon. I love this. It's almost as if your PS4 dashboard itself is the main menu, and you know you're just one click away from being dropped headfirst into that terrifying L-shaped corridor. It acts almost as a constant tether between the player and the game itself. Even the pause menu is mostly superficial. This menu is pretty bare bones, you can adjust various minor settings, but for the most part you won't have much of a reason to use it. However, if you think you can use it to hide from the ghost Lisa, then you're in for a big surprise because, as it turns out, she can just grab you right out of it.
Thank you for your follow. Yeah, Kojima is fucking amazing. I mean, that was...
Yes, Lisa can break the pause menu and instantly kill you. On top of that, you can find a literal puzzle piece of one of the game's minor puzzles in the pause menu. Honestly, this is just so awesome. It makes use of the pause menu in a way that completely subverts player expectations while simultaneously making sure that the pause doesn't serve as a safe zone for the player in case they get too scared. If anything, it's quite dangerous to try it. A lot of games have pause menus that are just little windows where you can still see what's going on in-game. PT does something that's very fresh, aesthetically speaking, and allows you to see just a little bit of what's in-game at the top edge of the screen. You're allowed to see just the tiniest little bit, which is frightening on a more subconscious level for those who do not notice this little detail. Because of all of this, pausing when you feel you're in danger is basically the equivalent to closing your eyes and hoping the monster goes away. It may mess with you and pretend it's not there, but if it wants to grab you, it will. Furthermore, if you allow yourself even a peek, you might see something particularly unsettling. What makes this even more unnerving is that the pause menu does in fact pause the game. If you pause the game while the radio is on, it will stop and pick up where you left off when you leave the pause menu. This means that Lisa herself operates outside the rules of the game, a fact that left me with goosebumps as soon as I came to the realization. I know I have a whole section dedicated to Lisa, so I'll try to avoid talking too in-depth about her, but that being said, she will be popping up a lot throughout these videos. What can I say? She's the star of the show. This style of intentionally unorthodox design that subverts the idea of a fourth wall establishes that the game is not something you play, but the game is something that you experience as it plays you.
Touch that dial now, we're just getting started. Retrieved the rifle and shot his wife as he was cleaning up the kitchen. You can't trust the tap water. Though the son came to investigate the commotion, the father shot him too. His 6-year-old daughter had the good sense to hide in the bathroom, but reports suggest he lured her out by telling her it was just a game. The girl was found shot once in the chest from point-blank range. The mother, who was shot in the stomach, was 204-863. Seen after neighbors called 911, found the father in his car listening to the radio. Several days before the murders, look behind you. I said, look behind you, like he was chanting some strange spell. There was another family shot to death in the same state last month, and in December last year, a A man used a rifle and meat cleaver to murder his entire family. In each case, the perpetrators were fathers. State police say this string of domestic homicides appears under 204863. Child care and other social issues facing the average family.
And that, to me, is exactly what great horror does. Control is something that, when granted, provides a semblance of clarity, thus allowing us to feel comfort in some way. If we feel as though we have a firm grasp of the situation, we won't be nearly as frightened by it. PT is especially brilliant because it makes sure to remind the player through a varying number of immediately apparent design choices that they are not in control, and they will not be in control at any point throughout the experience. It's brilliant. On another topic pertaining to the presentation, there are very few instances of dialogue or reading notes that come up, and they all usually come without any degree of context to the player outside of their own personal inference. This is to be expected from a demo, but more often than not when you do encounter any dialogue or notes in PT, it will either be directed outright at you, or spoken in a way that makes you just kinda lean back and wonder, "You talking to me?" And I don't mean the player character, I mean you, the player, specifically. When you have a game that's so incredibly vague and esoteric, it can be extremely discomforting and even disorienting when it decides to focus its lens on you. It's almost as if the game itself is looking right back at you, pointing at you, signaling you out and letting you know it's almost aware of your existence, and that the player character is just some avatar. In a game where everything seems so heavily grounded in realism, it's disorienting when you suddenly are referred to, even indirectly. It's simultaneously creepy and even invasive feeling when you're so immersed that even the game seems to become aware of your presence. When it comes to the presentation of PT, everything is put together with the idea that the player is not only heavily immersed, but actively engaged in a way that makes them feel like they themselves are walking through the hallway as all these horrific events unfold. While the photorealism and stellar sound design certainly help immerse us, I believe it's PT's unconventional methods of playing with the fourth wall, coupled with its very well thought out pacing and structure, that truly make it engaging as a whole. From the moment we start playing, the game's roots in Japanese horror help acclimate us to the setting. PT starts you off in a mostly familiar environment that almost comes off as comfortable, albeit quite messy and having questionable design choices. You just can't shake the feeling, though, that something is off. It's honestly difficult to pinpoint, but something really just doesn't feel right. Sure, the house is clearly a mess, and the creaking of the light in the front entryway is a bit creepy, but for the most part it's just a comfortable little hallway. Then you cross through the second door, and suddenly you realize something is up.
Your neighbors called 911, found the father in his car, listening to...
Oh yeah, the objective is to escape.
Days before the
Escape.
That's it.
Shit's locked.
Shit's locked.
Jeez, that door animation.
Okay, well.
Looks like a very similar hallway.
Hello? Well, it's definitely got the mood right. And by right, I mean horrible. Oh, good! Oh, good, it's an endless loop. I love when I get stuck in an endless loop of nightmares.
Let's go downstairs. This is the same hallway. Ah! It's going to be one of those things. Just a never-ending loop. Okay.
What is wrong with people? What? Isn't this the... It is the same corridor!
Before the murders, neighbors say they heard the father repeating a sequence of numbers in a loud voice. They said it was like he was chanting some strange spell.
Oh, Jesus. Ooh. Ooh, okay. Just a door opening. This seems very familiar.
I think that first time going through the loop door is something that sticks with every player to some extent. Pretty much everyone I've ever seen play this game has taken a moment to go, huh, upon going through for the first time. The game then slowly begins to introduce one piece of the puzzle after another, having started off simple with a radio broadcast about men murdering their families, and eventually kicking into high gear with full-blown acid trips culminating in a woman being murdered off-screen while the same voice from the radio rants about society being rotten to the core.
Upstanding folks got their welfare cut, got their jobs pulled out from under us. Yeah, you know what to do. Now's the time. Do it.
The various quirks and oddities prompt the player to ask questions, sometimes subconsciously and sometimes quite actively. The game does a stellar job of piling these questions on in a way that doesn't feel overwhelming until the horror itself is. It lures us in by immersing us before making it feel as though we were never meant to step foot inside these accursed halls. At first things are spooky, and you have some questions, but it isn't until later that you're nearly collapsing under the weight and sheer terror of it all. It's almost a literal rabbit hole, and by the time you realize the extent of the nightmare, it's far too late. There are a vast number of mysteries surrounding PT that keep the player's curiosity at a peak even after the game has been turned off. PT isn't just posing unanswerable questions for the sake of mystique, however. It commands genuine curiosity from the player by raising questions you feel can actually, feasibly be answered, or at least speculated on with some degree of accuracy. Wonder and horror go hand in hand. If the audience knows everything, then there's typically nothing to fear. But on the flip side, if you just make everything unknowable and vague, then there will always be a certain degree of engagement that's detracted from the experience. There's a significant difference between being encouraged to come up with answers and being forced to fill in plot holes. For example, Lovecraft is known for keeping things vague and creepy, but he does a good job at making sure you know just enough to keep your mind going and your imagination running wild. He's subtly directing us to imagine horrors as close to the unimaginable as we can, causing a certain degree of mental exhaustion that leaves us vulnerable to the real horrors in store for us. PT is much the same, as it strikes a balance between the two issues masterfully by making you feel like the answers to any questions you have are just out of arm's reach. But because it's only a demo for a game that was ultimately cancelled, you'll never be able to have a solid grasp on those answers. Try and try as you like, no matter how hard you reach, you'll never get a hold of the answer you seek. At least not with maximal certainty. It all comes together brilliantly. PT presents paranormal concepts within a familiar environment, adding a real sense of tangibility to everything that occurs in the game, thus allowing us to be properly immersed. It's a very disturbing kind of psychological horror that feels invasive, which again furthers on the idea that everything in PT is working in a very unconventional way, with the end goal of completely subverting the fourth wall and scaring the player half to death. Because of this, it begins to feel much more real than any other horror game has ever managed so far. It's not about looking real, although it certainly does, or having a particularly scary monster, which I would also argue it does. It's about feeling so real that the player themselves begin to ask questions that lead them further down the rabbit hole. It's a unique brand of horror that can shake a person to the core if they let just the right amount of it in. PT is a pretty damn spooky game on a superficial level, sure. The graphics are photorealistic, the sound design is genuinely bone-chilling, it references both possible and historical real-world events, and hell, Lisa is enough to scare the shit out of just about anyone. But where PT truly begins to feel very eerily tangible is when you begin to look at how unconventionally it works on a mechanical level. The way it draws the player in with obtuse storytelling that relies mostly on the player's ability to read the environment and put together extremely vague pieces of an unknowable puzzle, the way its mechanics and puzzles invite you to think outside the box and take approaches you wouldn't even think to take in other games. PT is the complete package, and I've honestly never experienced anything like it, even in games that shamelessly try to emulate what it accomplished. Even with games that mimicked Amnesia, there was always some degree of iteration going on, but I defy you to name a game that has a final puzzle remotely like that of PT's. I'm sure someone has made one out there somewhere, but for the life of me, I can't find it, and as of the recording, I have not played it. Now, it's not to say that every concept in PT is entirely original. Fourth wall breaks, the Onryo, radio shenanigans, we've seen all of this before, sure, but what makes PT special is how everything comes together so cohesively and organically. To reference Nicky Jakey once again,
this shit is just the ultimate cocktail of interactive terror.
All of the game's systems and mechanics come together in a way that feels natural, thus more real and tangible, and thus more horrifying. If even one aspect of PT was half-baked or mediocre, the whole experience would be strongly affected by it. That's part of the reason I wanted to start talking about the presentation, because now that we have a clear picture of what exactly PT is going for, and the general design philosophy, we can now assess the rest of the game and gauge just how well it does so. I suppose now I should make it clear that although I will be providing personal input in doses, I'm going to do my best to analyze PT as objectively as possible, though I can't guarantee I'll succeed as I do have a very strong love for the product. I really want to try and reach the crux of just what it is that makes this experience so haunting and give the game the credit it deserves. So that about does it for the presentation of PT. It's honestly surreal to finally have this portion of the essay and now the video done. That's one section down, to counting my personal intro I guess, with about 6 more to go. We've obviously still got a long way to go, but I sincerely appreciate it if you've even made it this far. I'm not exactly expecting this to blow up or anything, but as someone aspiring to create my own works of horror someday, this kind of project means a great deal to me. And I'm hoping that it isn't just some massive flop from the perspective of my audience, whether it be just one person or 100. I guess the typical YouTuber line here is to like, share, subscribe, etc., but if you are interested in PT and studying its value as a piece of fictional horror, then you should definitely subscribe and stay tuned for further analysis. Like I said, I got about half a dozen more sections to go here, and there will be plenty of content for you to indulge in if this is your thing. Also, if there is anything at all I can ask of you, it's to leave a comment telling me what you think, not just about Silent Hills, but about my work so far, and any positives or negatives you could think of to help me focus on so as to improve in future content. I welcome all criticism, provided it's actually constructive, of course, and genuinely appreciate any amount of praise there is to give. So don't be shy to throw either at me if you feel what you have to say can be slightly meaningful to me as a creator. Anyways, a sincere thanks to all of those who've made it this far with me. I do hope to see you again next time. If you do find this video to be meaningful, then, well...
Don't touch that dial now, we're just getting started.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to my analysis of PT Silent Hills. My name is Loveless, and tonight we're going to be looking at the story of PT, and this one's going to be a bit weird to try and unpack, so I'll definitely try my best to discuss it as cohesively as possible, but that may prove difficult at times, so I apologize if this is one of the rougher sections of the series. This section is going to be more of an interpretive piece than a review, because ultimately PT was designed to be interpreted, examined, and discussed above all. Theories about what is even going on vary wildly, and I don't really think it would make sense to review a story when, in order to do so, I would basically have to resort to reviewing my own interpretation of the story, which, in and of itself, would be open to misinterpretation. I find PT's story to be one of horror games' most fascinating and elusive subjects, primarily due to the incomplete nature of the product. The loose ends in PT's narrative start and end with the demo, meaning that all we can ever infer about it will come straight from the demo itself, or any past interviews with Kojima and co. discussing it, of which there are not many. Combine these loose ends with an already very obtuse narrative built primarily from vague, non-linear storytelling, and you've got a genuinely enthralling mystery to try and piece together. As an aside, the idea that PT isn't representative of the final product of Silent Hills is also a rather curious bit to digest. We know Norman Reedus actually played the character that we play as in PT, and given he showed up in the final reveal trailer once we beat the game, it's fair to assume he would star in the final product as the protagonist, likely the same protagonist we played as in PT, or at least some finished imagining of them. So, would PT have tied in at all to the story of Silent Hills? Was PT always destined to be an isolated short story, or would it have been followed up on? This raises so many questions, but we may never know the truth. It's a lot of fun to speculate on because what we are given is not only captivating, but also surprisingly layered in how it can be interpreted in so many ways. It's a real mystery with multiple conflicting possibilities that only becomes further complicated when taken into consideration that it probably took place within the canon of Silent Hill, an often obtuse and, dare I say, inconsistent franchise.
Are you talking about the monsters?
Monsters? They looked like monsters to you?
There's at least 12 dimensions. And now that's why all the top scientists and billionaires are coming out saying it's a false hologram. It is artificial. The computers are scanning it and finding tension points where it's artificially projected and gravity's bleeding in to the...
Even if you're like me and really only consider the works of Team Silent, in other words the first 4 games, to be part of the true or primary canon, there's still a lot to discuss with those games as it is. Hell, I'd argue that Silent Hill 2 alone is still resting comfortably in the pinnacle of video game narratives thanks primarily to its obtuse and non-traditional methods of storytelling. Silent Hill conceptually is utterly fascinating, and given its abstract nature, the idea of a concrete canon is difficult to try and pin down, even for the most die-hard fans. To some, what's considered canon may start and end with the games themselves, but to others there may need to be an occasional reference to external sources, such as the Tibetan Book of the Dead or Native American mythology. Hell, even if you were to try and keep things simple and just look at the happenings of the games, you then have multiple endings to try and account for, as well as the issue of Team Silent's works versus the Western series. How much of Shattered Memories should be considered canon? If you're a fan of the franchise, you probably have an immediate answer to the question, but it's likely not the same answer that someone else is thinking of. It's widely recognized that James Sunderland stumbling across a Shiba Inu named Mira at a computer, controlling everything that happened within Silent Hill, is a non-canonical joke ending, but does that even mean that there is a canonical ending? If so, there's sure to be a debate, and if not, then that means the Shiba Inu ending is equally as canonical as any other ending. This franchise is pretty far out there, and we're not even onto the story of PT yet. Really, the only Silent Hill media that I think we can all agree is not canonical in any way, shape, or form would be the films, if you can call them that. Anyways, the point here is that Silent Hill is a difficult franchise to try and justify a definitive canon for, and to a similar effect, PT is an extremely difficult game to make a concrete interpretation of. The story of PT is delivered out of context and at varying points in time, and fully expects the players to piece it together themselves. It's all very intentionally obtuse and difficult to digest comprehensively, but that's not to say it's an impossible undertaking. I should add that I feel it's important for me to distinguish what is directly given to us by PT and what is strictly my own interpretation of the story, as there are certain critical plot points that are clearly left open for interpretation. Furthermore, from a metagame perspective, we simply don't know what Kojima's ultimate goals were with the story, and it's possible he may someday release a statement completely invalidating everything I theorize about. For all we know, the story was never even meant to be followed up on, and Kojima deliberately left it open-ended so that people like me would give it way more attention than it otherwise would have gotten. As it stands, I legitimately have no way of knowing whether or not PT will ever be followed up on by those who worked on it. I am sure, however, that Konami will do their absolute best to try and bastardize it. This has been a particularly difficult aspect of the game to approach for me, as the story is told more so in hints, context clues, and by piecing together various moments of the game rather than just providing us with a straightforward narrative. I'm going to start off by giving you my overall interpretation of the story, with on-screen elaborations for more specific points. That way you as the audience don't potentially feel jarred if I say something that seems rather left field. Then follow up by discussing the various happenings of the game in more depth so you can understand how I came to my ultimate conclusion. I understand this might not be the best structure for an analytical approach, but I will be as concise as possible in my explanations. I also just want to make it clear that I'm not at all trying to lead the evidence towards my preferred conclusion. My initial interpretation of this game's story is so far removed from what I understand now, and just through redrafting this piece of the essay alone, I've discovered a handful of very interesting things within the game even I was originally unaware of that made me rethink certain key plot points entirely. With a game like PT, there are a number of legitimate possible interpretations, and I strongly encourage you all to give your own 2 cents as well. I find the story fascinating, and I'm personally very interested in what other people have to say regarding the subject. I tried at one point to discuss the story sequence by sequence, but honestly that was such a terrible approach and it was such a colossal mess that I can't be bothered with it. The story itself is not structured in a way that can be pieced together in the same way the game itself is on a mechanical level. When I tried this, it was just a jumbled mess that had me saying things like, "Let's make a note of this," or "Let's put a pin in that," or something to that effect far more than I would have liked. I hope it doesn't come off as patronizing, but I legitimately do not believe that anyone could have been able to follow along with that, primarily because I myself couldn't even imagine doing so, and I was the one writing the script. So with all of that said, and without further ado, here's my interpretation of the story of PT, Silent Hills. 10 months prior to the events of PT, our main character was fired from his job, so he descended into alcoholism to cope. This man continues to spiral out of control, constantly listening to the radio and reading deep into conspiracy theories that reaffirm his beliefs that society is actively working against people like him.
I'm talking to all the fine, upstanding folks got their welfare cut, got their jobs pulled out from under us.
His wife, Lisa, was forced to get a part-time job where her boss, Jack, made a number of unwanted sexual advances. Eventually, Lisa was coerced by Jack into having sex, and this led to her becoming pregnant. Lisa more than likely attempted to end the pregnancy, starting with the morning after pill and going so far as to intentionally miscarry. Eventually, however, her spouse catches on, and ultimately goes insane, consuming a massive amount of drugs and alcohol, and then proceeding to murder Lisa by gouging her eyes out, attempting to drown her in the tub, and finally cutting her throat.
Now's the time. Do it.
After realizing what he's done, our protagonist makes his way to the garage where he attempts to hang himself with a garden hose. Eventually, he reawakens to find himself trapped in the maddening depths of Silent Hill, manifesting in his home. Here, he is tormented by the vengeful Onryo, A Japanese spirit of vengeance similar to what you would find in Ju-on, The Grudge, The Ring, of Lisa, who is more than likely suffering here as well. Eventually, after facing his past, the man progresses through to Silent Hill, never to be seen again. So that's my interpretation. Obviously, there's quite a bit to unpack here. The root of PT's story is its characters, and at the core of it all, I find, is Lisa. Much like Silent Hill 2's Mary, Lisa acts as the primary point to move the story forward from, filling the role of an antagonist of sorts as well as being the catalyst for several key events, the most significant being her murder at the hands of her partner. The first possible introduction we have to Lisa's character comes with the torn picture of her on the wall. Even before we're able to start finding its pieces, we can read what's written on it.
My voice, do you hear it? The sign, can you read it? I'll wait forever if you'll just come to me.
As we find the missing pieces of the picture later on, we are given a number of bizarre messages that eventually piece together, much like the picture, to form a complete piece of writing.
I whispered your name, but the wind of the night took your voice away. I didn't move anymore during the waiting. Then his fingers slipped on my hand. It was a cold hand. Body was trembling. Never moving a step. His hand in mine. I waited for it to pass. And through the mist of fading consciousness, I believe, I heard a phone.
And finally, we have the reverse audio clips, only one of which I can actually find a reliable trigger for. When put together, these clips very closely resemble what is said with each piece of the picture frame.
I walked till I stood one pace before Jack. We share an instant of private darkness. The moment our hands overlap, heart pounding. His touch, cold like marble. So much that he was trembling. I whispered his name, and the night took the sound of his voice away.
Tanto que todo él temblaba, su toque, frío como el mármol, et la nuit a emporté le son de sa voix. J'ai chuchoté son nom. We share an instant of private darkness. In the moment our hands overlap, heart pounding. I walked till I stood one pace before Jack.
So clearly these messages all tie together into something resembling that of a story. But what does it all mean? To me, all of these messages depict a scene, one particular moment in time that is absolutely critical to the story of PT. A lot of these messages seem to be very sensual, almost romantic. An instant of private darkness, hands overlapping, hearts pounding, standing one pace before Jack, whispering his name, and a specific reference to the night all seem indicative of an intensely sexual encounter. You'd be forgiven if you assumed that this was referring to an experience between Lisa and the main character, perhaps even on their wedding night, given how much their marriage is referenced in photos and how deeply personal this scene being depicted appears to be. But there are specific lines that have caused me to rethink this hypothesis. Why would Lisa in these messages reference her husband's touch as cold like marble? It seems very odd to talk about your life partner, especially if it was a reference to the consummation of their marriage in that way, wouldn't you say? Now sure, perhaps she was just remembering the moment as vividly as possible, and for whatever reason, he just had a really cold touch. I'm willing to grant that, so for now let's just put a pin in this. Why then would Lisa be never moving a step, and why would she have waited for it to pass? If it was an intensely romantic encounter, wouldn't she instead be moving with him, existing in a state of bliss and never wanting it to end? The kind of language used here is indicative of someone who is in an extremely uncomfortable, perhaps even dreadful situation that they want no part of. It implies a certain nervousness that more closely resembles dread and discomfort than sensuality and passion. This is not romantic language by any stretch, and thus I don't think it could be referring to an experience she had with the main character. Or at least no experience that we can find or even infer from what is conveyed to us in-game. However, if we consider the possibility of her having had an intimate encounter with someone else, there seems to be an immediately possible candidate. Remember what the child told us about a certain she at the end of the red hallway segment? The manager liked how she looked in a skirt. Not only do we know Lisa was carrying a child at some point, as visually indicated by her swollen stomach, but we also know that the pregnancy itself led to some sort of violence, as indicated by the blood on that area of her dress, as well as the child's constant torment, being left in the sink, as well as shrieking in terror as it swings in the fridge later on in the game. As for what type of violence the child incurred, there are a few context clues. It is of course possible that the main character ultimately killed it, along with Lisa, that would be a given. However, I could argue, and I will argue, that Lisa herself was at least in some way against the idea of having the child, and wanted to terminate the pregnancy herself. Firstly, we never see Lisa acting protectively towards the child in-game, something I immediately found curious my first time playing it years ago. I actually remember, following the sequence where you're locked in the bathroom, thinking that if I approached the child again, it would surely trigger an attack from Lisa. This turned out to be untrue, of course, and to say I was vexed would be an understatement. Sure, she closes the door on us the first time we attempt to look in the bathroom where we heard the child from, but there are a vast number of possible explanations for why she would be doing this. On a purely mechanical level, it's just a good jump scare. Honestly, I just think she was trying to screw with us, as that's pretty much her MO for the entire demo. There's really just no indication as to what she's doing in there otherwise. If we approach the child at any other point in the game, she makes no active attempt to prevent us from getting to him. Sure, she'll screw with us using the mirror, or even appear in the bathroom to possess us, but in no way are we actually punished for approaching the child aside from her usual shenanigans. All of this indicates to me that she only sees the child as a means of screwing with the main character. Now, why do you think that is? Why does it seem as though she doesn't care at all for the child's well-being? Why would she, if she did, attempt to terminate her pregnancy? I think the answer is rather apparent once all of this has been pieced together. I should quickly note that in regards to the ghost of Lisa, there are a few possibilities regarding her behavior in relation to the child, which I will be covering in more depth in the actual Lisa section of the essay. However, the question of how she felt about the child, even when she was still alive, bears a great deal of weight within the context of the story. It's important not to disregard how she probably felt about having an unplanned child, especially given her financial struggles as well as her spouse, who was spiraling out of control. On top of that, it's quite possible her spouse was not the father, which would further complicate matters for her. I believe the instant of private darkness Lisa shared was not with the main character, but with her boss, Jack. Given how uncomfortable she appears in the messages depicting this scene, it's clear that this encounter was not something she expressly consented to. Not long after this, Lisa realized she was pregnant, and eventually, so too did her husband. Unfortunately for Lisa, regardless of the circumstance of its conception, our main character did not believe the child to be his. To quickly double down on this theory, there are also some external sources that might have hinted towards the story of Silent Hills being something that would have been much more unsettling than we would have expected. In an interview with The Hollywood Reporter, Norman Reedus mentions that he was actually happy when Silent Hills didn't get made, referencing Death Stranding as way better and a completely different thing. Death Stranding, despite how brooding and atmospheric it can be, is a near-unendingly positive experience that celebrates humanity and cooperation, love, art, etc. So I ask, what would be completely different from that, thematically and tonally? Perhaps an exploration into just how far the human mind can descend? An unapologetic look at how repulsive humanity can be, perhaps? A game that fully confronts the real horrors that humans are capable of? That sounds a lot like what we were potentially looking at with Silent Hills. Further adding to this is a comment straight from Kojima during an interview at Gamescom 2014, where he expressly stated, "There's a limit of how scary you can make a game, but in this case we're totally ignoring that, and you know what? If you don't want to keep playing through the game, so be it. We don't care. That's the game we are aiming for."
But one thing that you have to keep in mind is that if a game is too scary, people just won't play it.
で、映画とかそのアトラクション、レールに乗り物に乗っていくやつは目をつぶってても出口に出るんですけど、ウォークスルーのゲームっていうのをやめてしまうんで、あんまり怖いゲームなかったと思いますけど、僕らはそれをやろうとしてるんで、まあ途中でやめてくれて結構ですと。まあ怖くてできなくてもいいんですけど、もうそれが人生で一番怖いような、うんこを漏らすような、うんこを漏らしてしまったようなゲームっていうのを目指してますんで、まあそこは怖がりの人はちょっとできないかもしれませんけど、そこは期待してもらっていいところですね。
So the one thing in movies or in attractions, you know, it's about to start pressing the play button or just getting in the ride, and you know, if it gets too scary, just keep your eyes shut and somehow it'll be over. But if it's a game, people will just stop, you know, and won't keep on playing. So that's why there's a limit of how scary you can make a game. But in this case, we're totally ignoring that. And you know what? If you don't want to keep playing through the game, so be it. We don't care. That's the game we are aiming for. We're aiming for a game that will make you shit your pants. And so yeah, that's.
パンツの替えは持ってくださいね。
So please make sure you have some changes.
はい。限定版にはパンツをつけるかもしれません。限定版には。
The limited edition will probably include a pair of trousers for everyone.
So it's quite clear that Kojima was willing to go to extreme lengths with Silent Hills, and knowing that, as well as how Norman Reedus felt about the story, it's clear that this was going to be a game that pulled no punches. I want to make it clear that I don't think these quotes prove there was definitively some subplot that would explore sexual coercion, just that I think it's clear that Kojima was eager to take this story in uncomfortable directions, and that this type of issue would not be outside the realm of possibility. Furthermore, this is subject matter that Silent Hills has explored before, most notably Silent Hill 2, which was bold enough to have a teenage girl whose subplot revolved around sexual abuse be promoted on the cover art of the North American release. So this caliber of narrative is definitely not outside the realm of possibility for a game of this lineage. So given what Norman Reedus said, I suppose now would be a good time to discuss our main character. Well, we actually know quite a bit, but I think his descent into madness requires a fair amount of investigation. We know that he must have been quite the guy to be working a job that allowed for Lisa to stay home, but ultimately, you got fired so you drowned your sorrows in booze, as the child tells us. But there are some blanks to fill in. We can infer that he picked up another job as he was able to afford a lot of alcohol, all the while still paying bills alongside his wife, but what more do we know? Well, I have an idea, but I need you to bear with me because it may go into some topics that not everyone likes to discuss. I promise, however, that it's not without its reasons.
Listen carefully, like a good boy.
It's something that should not be passed on. Should that information be left at the mercy of nature, the digital society? The untested truths, spun by different interests, continue to churn.
I suppose now is as good a time as ever to make it clear where I stand on the topic of approaching politics and artistic analysis. This is an unfortunately bitter pill for many people to swallow, given the current global climate regarding politics and various non-political subjects and debates that politicians have somehow managed to encroach upon in recent decades. There is nothing inherently wrong with discussing politics when discussing art. Frankly, there are some pieces of art that would be impossible to discuss in as much depth as they deserve without taking politics into consideration. For instance, how is one to discuss Assassin's Creed all the while completely avoiding the negative effects religion has on society when governments rely on religious aristocracy versus the needs and ambitions of its people? How is one to discuss the complex worlds of Fallout or even the Outer Worlds without inevitably tackling the issues of democracy and capitalism? Or what about films such as The Last Jedi or Captain Marvel, which make it blatantly clear what side of the political spectrum they're trying to appeal to? I bring up multiple pieces of art that take a variety of approaches that range in both quality and presentation because I feel it's important to acknowledge both the strengths and weaknesses of each end of the spectrum in each and every work that I review, and I simply refuse to shy away from the facts as they appear to be presented from the artists behind these games and films just because some people feel uncomfortable with the subject matter. In talking about Lisa, I made it abundantly clear that she was potentially raped by her boss, because that is potentially what happened in the story and there is evidence backing that claim up. Evidence that I hopefully presented thoroughly enough for my audience to make a healthy evaluation of. In previous works, Kojima has tackled issues such as nuclear deterrence, war economy, and the manipulation of the mass media for upwards of 3 decades now. So if you're interested in a discussion about a work of his, but also want the discussion to shy away from subjects that are inherently political, then I'm sorry, but his games do bring up these issues and I have no control over that. Politics and art are not mutually exclusive subjects, so if politics are involved, I will not shy away from them. However, what I want to make clear is that I will not be quote-unquote taking sides, and that whatever politics I discuss within any piece of art will be derived solely from that which I am covering, and perhaps its relation to what occurs in the real world. For instance, in PT, the very first radio broadcast we hear references a congressional debate over gun control.
As the congressional debate over gun control flares up yet again, we regret to report the murder of a wife and her 2 children by their husband and father. The father purchased the rifle used in the crime at his local gun store 2 days earlier. This brutal killing took place while the family was gathered at home on a Sunday afternoon. The day of the crime, the father went to the trunk of his car, retrieved the rifle, and shot his wife as she was cleaning up the kitchen after lunch. When his 10-year-old son came to investigate the commotion, the father shot him too. His 6-year-old daughter had the good sense to hide in the bathroom, but reports suggest he lured her out by telling her it was just a game. The girl was found shot once in the chest from point-blank range. The mother, who he shot in the stomach, was pregnant at the time. Police arriving on scene after neighbors called 911 found the father in his car listening to the radio. Several days before the murders, neighbors say they heard the father repeating a sequence of numbers in a loud voice. They said it was like he was chanting some strange spell. There was another family shot to death in the same state last month, and in December last year, a man used a rifle and meat cleaver to murder his entire family. In each case, the perpetrators were fathers. State police say this string of domestic homicides appears unrelated, though it could be part of a larger trend such as employment, child care, and other social issues facing the average family.
PT was released in 2014, and it just so happens that, at the time, issues of gun control were becoming a pretty hot topic. This allows PT to feel grounded in its opening minutes, which, as I discussed in my Part 1, allows the player to become more immersed more quickly. It's a world that they can sympathize with. The player's beliefs regarding the subject are completely irrelevant, because thankfully, PT isn't concerned with taking sides or making political statements, and I think players everywhere understood that. I believe my audience, whether it be 2 subscribers or 2,000 subscribers, is able to manage my discussing the various political subjects that relate to PT and whatever else I may cover in the future. But I do understand these are difficult subjects, and I acknowledge that not everyone with access to YouTube is going to be capable of withstanding the difficulties that come from these types of discussions. If politics is not your cup of tea, then I completely understand if this is just not the video for you. However, I'd like to make it as clear as possible that when I discuss these subjects, they do not pertain to my own beliefs, and they are in no way trying to encroach upon your own. These discussions are purely in relation to the work I'm tackling, and works that may or may not relate to it, and I am frankly not concerned with patronizing anyone's beliefs, whether they agree with me or oppose me. You are free to believe whatever you like, and as long as you're not hurting anyone, your beliefs will not be attacked on this channel. Just don't expect every piece of art I cover not to make an attempt to challenge your beliefs in some way. Personally speaking, I really enjoy it when a piece of work makes me reconsider and reevaluate my own positions. If I were to ever give Fallout New Vegas a proper review, then the issues of capitalism and democracy would inevitably come up, and perhaps I would reference what it made me think of personally back in the day when I first tried the game out. But I would hope that your beliefs are matured enough that whatever discussion does occur in that series would either strengthen your resolve, or perhaps serve as a positive stepping point for reevaluation. However, what you personally think regarding these subjects is entirely on you, and I'm in no way trying to influence that. I'm here to discuss art that I feel very passionately about, and I want to discuss everything I can in relation to them. If I cared about influencing anyone's political ideologies, then PT would be an incredibly odd place to start, wouldn't you say? So for those of you who are still following, I'd just like to offer a quick thanks for making it through that little rant. First, take a look at what is directly presented to us about the main character. These wedding photos are pretty old-fashioned, wouldn't you say? They're even in black and white. We also know that Lisa wasn't working prior to her husband's firing, which is a pretty old-fashioned thing for a couple in the mid-2010s. And when she did start working, she lacked a lot of skill required for even a basic job. As mentioned by the child who tells us the only reason she could earn a wage at all was the manager liked how she looked in a skirt. There are even some things we find in the house that seem a bit dated by modern standards. What's the deal with his radio? Why not just use your phone rather than this hunk of junk? Do you see where I'm going with this? Allow me to stockpile a bit more evidence before you just take me at my word. Remember what the man on the radio said? There's a congressional debate over gun control flaring up yet again. Not only that, but in this particular state, there's a trend of domestic homicides, all of which seem to involve a rifle. Not just a handgun, a rifle. What kind of state has local gun stores all over the place to the point that a radio broadcast talking about these stories in bizarre levels of detail can't even bother to mention a single one of these stores by name? Also, can I just mention how interesting I think it is that Norman Reedus' character is wearing a jacket? His breath is clearly visible in the reveal trailer, but the weather itself is only a bit foggy and dreary. It's not freezing cold from what we can tell, nor is it snowing. PT itself dropped in August, so given all of these details, I think it's fair to assume it's set rather late in the year, probably between August and October, somewhere in central United States. The outside area we see in the reveal trailer, and in the investigation from Lance McDonald, seems to be more of a town than a city. Note the lack of particularly tall buildings, and, most of all, complete silence. I'm sure after hearing this, at least one of you is thinking, well, of course it's silent. It's Silent Hill. And to that I'll just say, well, pretty much every Silent Hill game occurs in a more rural setting, so thank you for proving my point. But seriously, name a city in the US where you can, at any point, see not even a soul, hear not even a peep, out in the middle of a fairly large intersection. I'm sure there is an answer to this somewhere out there, but for the life of me, I can't think of one myself. I imagine you figured out where I'm going with all of this. To put it bluntly, I think Norman Reedus' character had very traditional worldviews given the environment he more than likely spent his life in, and the life he shared with Lisa was something he felt very responsible for maintaining. When the man was fired from his job, he was left in a very compromised position, needing his wife to work so they could remain afloat. With his worldviews being challenged to an extent he simply was not prepared to handle, the man was left feeling utterly defeated. So what did he do? He turned to alcoholism and began indulging far too much in his radio, eventually growing to favor a station by a guy who clearly had very strange and far-leaning views, as made evident by the various broadcasts depicting the man as insensitive,
Police arriving on scene after neighbors called 911.
deranged, and implying he may have even incited violence on more than one occasion. The Swedish radio broadcast also references society being under control and mentions the War of the Worlds radio drama from decades past.
Slut dina ögon. Låt dina öron lyssna till radio. Hör du min röst? Kan du höra din egen själs skrik? Låt oss välja. Min röst som förtäljer framtiden eller dina plågade rop. Nå, vad väljer du? Du kan välja. Ditt liv, din framtid. Klok som du är, så kanske du redan upptäckte. Ja, radiodramat från 75 år sedan var sanning. De är här på vår. Och de övervakar och ser allt. Lita ej på myndigheterna. Lita ej på polisen. De är redan kontrollerade av dem. Så har det varit i 75 år nu. Endast vår mästare kan hålla honom. Du har en rätt. En rätt att bli en av oss. Så välkommen till vår värld. Mycket snart öppnas portarna till en ny dimension. 204863. 204863.
So it's pretty apparent that Norman wasn't just listening to your run-of-the-mill radio stations for the sake of keeping his mind occupied. He was definitely indulging in some tinfoil hat-level conspiracy news drama. In his mentally fragile state, between the emotional devastation he was already unequipped to handle, and if I could guess, more than likely trying to repress, and his frequent heavy drinking, the musings of the madman on the radio would have definitely had direct effects on his psyche. His mental state only continued to spiral until, well, you know the rest. Cut to the present time in PT, and our main characters find themselves trapped in the madness of Silent Hills. Our main character as the unknowingly persecuted, and Lisa as the sorrowful warden of his prison. Both are bound to one another while they incur physical and mental torment. However, as far as we're capable of knowing, only one is able to escape. Perhaps that means for Lisa that once her spouse is gone that she will be well again. Or perhaps her spirit left the house with Norman Reedus' character, and she'll continue to hunt him down and torment him forever, much as this game seems to have stayed with its players so many years after its untimely fate. Another important note I'd like to briefly discuss regarding PT's story is how I think it works as an interpretive piece. PT is, or at least was, first and foremost a marketing stunt, one that will likely never be replicated, at least to the same effect ever again. The whole point of PT was to get people to think, work together to solve some mysteries, speculate on what was to come. The story, at least purely within the confines of PT, was not meant to be a complete work. What's more is that the only other teaser we were given for Silent Hills, the concept trailer at the 2014 Tokyo Game Show, seems to have literally no relation to the story of PT itself whatsoever. PT is very intentionally open-ended. If they ever wanted to come back to it in the final product, they very well could have. If they chose to leave it be forever, then it would remain one of gaming's most fascinating mysteries. What ended up happening, of course, was the latter. And thankfully, what PT isn't is an incoherent or misleading mess like, say, Outlast or Five Nights at Freddy's, where the story basically makes no sense and the fans have to fill in the blanks for the writers. PT may be incomplete, but it is designed in a way that befits its open-ended nature. One last topic I suppose I need to cover is the autobiographical nature of Kojima's works. There are already countless videos discussing what Kojima might have been trying to convey with PT, as his previous work certainly holds some degree of self-referential material as well. I think it's pretty clear that Kojima, despite his good-natured and diplomatic approach to the situation with Konami, harbored some degree of resentment for the company and the direction it took. It doesn't take an expert to see that Kojima wanted to make massive, cinematic, thought-provoking titles, a mindset that no other Konami executive seemed to share. In a sense, PT was his last hurrah under the company, and some of the dialogue clearly seems to reflect that, primarily what we see in the final reveal with the voice telling us how Dad was such a drag. However, an alternative theory I'd like to propose is that maybe this voice was coming from the writers associated with Team Silent. Perhaps they were annoyed with Konami's treatment of Silent Hill as an IP, and this was their slight to the company. Of course, this is all speculative. I'm not going to pretend to understand the mind of Kojima, let alone act as though I have some level of insight into the goings-on of Konami, Kojima Productions, and its employees. If you want to dive down that rabbit hole of conspiracy theories, there are a plethora of other YouTube videos you can check out that cover that particular subject far more in depth than I really care to do here. I want to keep this section dedicated to the story and providing you with my interpretation, not the possibilities of what the artist might have been saying, because that's a near-endless discussion that I'm honestly just not prepared to make. Perhaps I'll cover it in a future video, but for now, I'll leave it as is. So that about does it for my interpretation of PT Silent Hills. What did you all think of it? This is probably the thing I'm most curious to see people comment on, as there are so many different possible interpretations that people have made over the years, ranging from conspiracy theories about the CIA Project MKUltra to theories that PT is actually the nightmare of Venom Snake during his coma leading up to the Phantom Pain. Those two interpretations alone are worlds apart, and yet somehow both have legitimate evidence backing them up. My interpretation is, of course, closer to that of a traditional Japanese horror story, particularly the most well-known of Japanese horror films. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Hideo Kojima's mantra that his body is 70% film. Japanese horror films are known for their surreal plots and themes of revenge. Their plots are often confusing, forcing the audience to ask questions, which may or may not lead them down a rabbit hole of further horror. If you ask me, I think I just described PT quite accurately. I do hope you all have enjoyed this particular section of the essay. Like I said, when I first started writing this, I actually had a few different ideas under my belt about what was going on, but as I analyzed the details, I began to come to a much stronger conclusion. I'm actually considering discussing various theories around PT in the future, but that's something I really can't be thinking about right now. But if you have an interest in that, please be sure to leave a comment letting me know.
This brutal killing took place while the family was gathered at home on a Sunday afternoon. Don't touch that dial now, we're just getting started. Retrieved the rifle and shot his wife.
My name is Loveless, and that was the story of PT, Silent Hills. Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest course in my dissection of PT Silent Hills. My name is Loveless, and tonight we're going to be taking a thorough look at atmosphere and why PT absolutely excels at creating one of, if not the, most intense atmospheres in a video game I have ever stepped into. Horror games thrive on creating an atmosphere that is dreadful for the player to experience. Think back to all the best horror games you've played, close your eyes, and just imagine what it would be like in that world yourself. The faint drip of water on stone floors in a pitch-black labyrinth. The ear-raking creak of the wooden floors against every step you take in an unknown land as the words of the dead grow louder with each passing second. The sound of enormous and yet rusty science fiction machinery clanging as your breaths tensely echo against the nothingness of space. For a video game to create a proper atmosphere is absolutely crucial. This isn't exclusive to horror games, of course. I think it applies to any other genre equally. Fallout New Vegas, Transistor, Shadow of the Colossus, Mass Effect, Jak 2, Deus Ex, Sons of Liberty, Bloodborne, Death Stranding, all of these games create utterly phenomenal atmospheres that help push them to the highest tiers of their respective genres. As crucial a component as it is, I feel as though it's important for me to pin down just what exactly I mean by atmosphere. When I say atmosphere, I'm referring to how the game's audio-visual designs work in tandem with the construction of the moment-to-moment gameplay to elevate the experience as a whole beyond the sum of its parts. A game's atmosphere is also created by context within the game world and functions as an overall setup for the mood the developers want the player to be in when experiencing their story. Examples of horror games that utterly excel at producing a strong atmosphere include the first 2 Dead Space games, Amnesia: The Dark Descent, Soma, Silent Hill 2, and Resident Evil. I don't think there are many people that would argue that PT doesn't have strong atmosphere, but what exactly is it that makes the game so nerve-wracking to play? What is it that makes the game's atmosphere so effective in instilling dread? There's actually a great deal to cover here, but if you don't mind me starting out rather plainly, I'd like to take a moment to credit this game for the shocking degree of photorealism its graphics have managed to reach. This demo has existed for over half a decade now, and it's still the closest I've ever seen a game come to photorealism. Don't get me wrong, plenty of games are definitely nearing the threshold of photorealism as we approach the 9th generation. Death Stranding, Devil May Cry 5, Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice, all of these games look incredible and have animations that are second to none. For now though, I think PT still holds the crown for pure photorealism. The game's got an obvious edge over plenty of other titles. It's running on the Fox engine, which alone is going to put it well above most other games of its time, but given just how focused the game is, with the tight hallway and lack of dynamic rendering required, it's no wonder that PT is so lifelike. The Fox engine made Metal Gear Solid 5 into a technical powerhouse, so it's not much of a surprise that when compressed into a game as small as PT that the engine would be capable of such incredible visual fidelity. I think one of the reasons PT is so utterly terrifying is in part due to its photorealism. The game is aged like fine wine, and there's a very real sense of tangibility to the overall aesthetic. For instance, when you look at the photographs, they don't stand out as awkwardly realistic amidst the environment. They fit right in. Again, I think a large part of what has made PT age so well is the lack of dynamic rendering, and there only being a handful of complex animations that occur in-game, several of which are supposed to stand out as unrealistic anyways. When it comes down to it, the only animations they really had to nail in terms of realism were the initial waking up animation, the fetus in the sink, the bag moving, the swinging chandelier and refrigerator, the blood spill from the refrigerator, the glass object being thrown from the balcony, picking up the flashlight in the bathroom, doors opening and closing, and the roaches. I'm not including the eyeball pictures in the final red hallway segment because, from what I can tell, they're just cycling JPEGs. Pretty much every other animation that occurs in the game is to do with Lisa, who is clearly supposed to stand out as paranormal, therefore would have generally more complex, albeit less grounded animations anyways. I don't want to make it seem as though technical quality is all there is to creating a proper horror game. There are, of course, many games that have been put together on shoestring budgets by incredibly small teams, if not a single person, that turned out to be not only effective, but largely impactful on the genre as a whole, for better or worse. However, PT definitely came out at a time where this type of budget was rarely, if ever, seen in horror games. At this point, we were 3 years removed from Dead Space 2 and still had over a year until the next truly great horror game in Soma. And even then, I doubt Soma or Alien Isolation's budgets even came close to what Konami was pouring into the Fox engine at the time. I can't confirm this, as hard budget numbers are difficult to come across with video games, but it is pretty well documented that Konami executives hated the Fox engine for costing a small fortune to develop games on, and Kojima had developed quite the reputation for taking a great deal of time, manpower, and funding to develop his games. So it makes sense that he would want to go as all out as possible on something he would have been so passionate about. My point here is that at this point in time, it was just nice to see a horror game being made with incredible funding and graphical quality. On the flip side, plenty of great horror games are quite dated when it comes to their graphical quality. The first 3 Silent Hill and Resident Evil games may not have been the most impressive visually, but they are still thought of rather fondly because their environments were so memorable. We all remember the foggy aesthetic of the first Silent Hill games, the terrifying mansion of the first Resident Evil, the dilapidated 90s infrastructure of Resident Evils 2 and 3. Anyone who's played these games will be able to remember, at least to some extent, several key locations from each game. PT shares a similar quality with these games through its L-shaped corridor. I think even if PT were to one day somehow look mediocre graphically, its infamous corridor and top-tier Ghost Girl waifu Lisa would still both be thought of very fondly due to how impactful they were on the player, and how visually striking they were regardless of photorealism. Everyone who has played this game is going to remember the hallway, or at the very least the moment they first realized they were trapped in a loop as they gazed down the same stretch of the exact same hall. The hallway is realistic on an aesthetic and graphical level, but in keeping with Japanese horror tradition, there's something subconsciously off about it overall. Why is this radio right in front of the front door? How in the hell are you supposed to get upstairs? These aren't questions that necessarily need to be answered. After all, we are dealing with a paranormal hallway that is looping infinitely, but these things will typically make the player scratch their chin and wonder just what the deal is. Much like the questions posed by the story, it's not about whether or not they can even be answered. It's how they engage the player, both consciously and subconsciously. There very well could be answers. For example, maybe the radio is right in front of the front door because the main character was so obsessed with it that he wanted to turn it on as soon as he got home. It could be a metaphorical representation turned physical, or it could have literally been just like that. We'll never know, but the tangibility of the possibilities makes for a much more engaging experience. Of course, engagement and immersion can be completely ruined if the game fails in auditory direction. This, I feel, is especially true for horror games. Try and imagine playing Amnesia: The Dark Descent without that shrill chase music, or Resident Evil 2 without the echo of Mr. X's footsteps.
God, I can hear his footsteps coming. The big guy's coming. Oh no! Yeah. Okay, he's in here. He's in here. Go! 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 Come on, you bastard! Get! Oh fuck! He didn't like that when I shot that.
If you were to do so, there would be an immediate sense of detraction from the experience, and the game would suffer a great deal from it.
There we go.
Sound quality is utterly crucial to horror games, and it's here that I think PT is at its strongest. What I'd like to highlight is how PT uses particularly eerie sound design to convey the paranormal, so as to elevate the mood as the player progresses. To clarify, think for a moment just how everything matches the photorealistic environment at first. The light that sways back and forth creaks eerily. The radio has an appropriate level of static sputtering from its broadcasts. Even your footsteps match your footwear and the surface they're pressing against with each step. When you start playing, there is really nothing unusual or even paranormal, but it's still enough to get you on your toes. It's just as vaguely creepy as any hallway can be during a stormy midnight hour. Then after your first encounter with the ghost Lisa, suddenly you're hearing things that you can't quite comprehend or put a mental image to. Not just Lisa's bizarre wailing and laughter, but the static and weird electronic tisms that occur with each haunting. Where is that noise supposed to be coming from? What does it even represent? Like many things in PT, you could reasonably hypothesize a number of explanations, but there really is no certain answer to what these sounds even are. Hell, if we want to look at it from a more meta perspective, we're probably never even going to know what Kojima Productions was using to create these sounds, making their origins all the more difficult to get a grasp of. These hauntings are utterly bone-chilling because they seem to occur at random and they can overwhelm the player on an auditory level similarly to the chase music in Amnesia: The Dark Descent. This is an extremely risky practice for any game developer because if it were to become repetitive, then it would be more annoying than terrifying. It's the type of audio that needs to be designed and implemented with the overall structure of the game in mind. Amnesia accomplished this by being sparing with its creature encounters and not applying the same effect to each creature. For example, the water monster. PT is similarly sparing in that you won't hear the effect for the majority of the game, which is already quite short as it is. You generally won't come across the haunting effect until you're pretty far into the game, and the only places you're likely to even get stuck on are the Hell puzzle and the final puzzle, the former of which most people don't seem to struggle with that much anyways. On top of this, the effect itself has enough variety in what you hear, and there's enough disorientation the player will be dealing with in the latter part of the game, so it's unlikely the player will be getting annoyed or even bored by it in their time playing PT. Honestly, it's just a brilliant piece of sound design. So what we now have are unintelligible sounds bombarding us within a hyper-realistic, yet increasingly bizarre environment. This, of course, would lead to a feeling of disorientation or general perplexion in the audience, one of which grows in tandem with the increasingly terrifying hallway loops, further offset by the increasingly obtuse puzzles you have to manage a degree of focus to solve, even if you've done it before. However, it takes more than just being perplexing, overwhelming, and weird to be an effective work of horror. So now that we have an understanding of how it is the audio visuals come together to affect the player, just what is it that makes all of this so scary? Even superficially, PT's hallway is dreadful and even nerve-wracking to spend time in. The aesthetics certainly help elevate it beyond your average horror experience, and the sound design is state-of-the-art. However, it takes more than surface-level scares to make a truly terrifying experience. The hallway isn't just terrifying to walk through because it looks the part, but also because it's constructed mechanically to keep the player on their toes at all times. The primary concern for the player is that your backside is always vulnerable, and if it's not, then you're more than likely not progressing as you should be, thus leaving yourself more vulnerable to an attack from the ghost. So you need to be able to navigate the hallway with some degree of understanding. The lack of concrete understanding of Lisa's AI certainly helps increase the tension also. You truly never know when your next major turn is going to put you face to face with the ghost. It's almost like a Rubik's Cube in the sense that, while you've got to try and navigate the hallway and solve its puzzles, which will generally only be picked up on by observing extremely subtle details, you've also got to keep in mind how Lisa might be behaving, and what you could do to set her off. As I said before, this becomes even more difficult to manage once you realize that Lisa's AI works outside the general understanding of the game's rules, a fact that the player will more than likely stumble across in a variety of ways, which I'll be sure to cover in the Lisa section of the videos. There's a sense of urgency in that you need to figure these puzzles out very quickly, all the while paying attention to very minute details, all of which can be difficult to manage while you're having the shit scared out of you. The terrifying aesthetics add to the sense of urgency by generally making you feel like you want to get out of the hallway as fast as possible. The sense of urgency causes you to try and act hastily and perhaps leave yourself prone to making a mistake, increasing your sense of vulnerability. Your understood sense of vulnerability then makes the aesthetics even more terrifying, as you mentally feel more open to harm than you would otherwise. It's a literal cycle of increasing terror, horror ad infinitum. Of course, I'm not saying the game is literally, objectively terrifying to a sum infinite, but once again that everything in the game is working together in tandem to create, as Nakey Jakey so well put it, the ultimate cocktail of interactive terror. So now that I've provided a fundamental breakdown as to why the atmosphere in PT is so effective, and how it works on a more mechanical level, I'm going to discuss how it is that the atmosphere is established at various points in the game. This way we can examine the game's mood and pacing in action, and make a more thorough deduction of the overall atmosphere as a whole, and where better a place to start than the very beginning. After the initial startup, which itself is notably silent and lacking in fluff and logos, we wake up in a concrete room. When the door creaks open, if you happen to be examining it extremely closely with high enough brightness settings, you may be able to make out a certain ghostly figure peeping in on you. Most people, of course, are unlikely to notice this on their very first playthrough. After stepping out into the hallway, the silence persists with the only sounds of note being your footsteps, the creak of the foyer light, the rain outside, and of course the radio. As simplistic as it is, I find this opening atmosphere to be extremely effective because it perfectly replicates a feeling that any human being is familiar with, being alone at home at night in a hallway. It's a very familiar motif that immediately provides a sense of genuine tangibility to the experience, which in turn makes the slow drip of the paranormal far more effective as the game progresses. This is a key trope to any Japanese horror story, the existence of the paranormal in familiar environments. Think about Ju-on, where the story takes place primarily within what anyone would be able to recognize as that creepy house down the street, or The Ring, which revolves around a creepy tape that just happened to be stumbled across. After a few mostly uneventful loops, we get our first true taste of the outright paranormal when we try to take a peek into the bathroom. That's when we get our first real look at the ghost, Lisa, but only briefly, and immediately following this there is a sharp, high-pitched ambiance that seems to exist primarily to convey to the player that the paranormal is about to be placed front and center. This is our second jump scare at this point in the game, however it's the first where we've been provided a perceivable threat, so now more than ever there is a heightened urge to move along. In the following loop, as we continue down the corridor, we're still able to hear Lisa's moaning from our right, leading the player to believe initially that she's still in the bathroom. However, once we turn the corner, we of course realize that this is far from the truth. Lisa is standing right there in full view, halting our progress. Or so we think. We of course don't have any choice. She refuses to move and we have nothing that we can interact with, so we approach her and just as we get close enough, the lights click off. As we approach where she stood, we can still hear her bizarre moaning. At this point, any player sporting a headset of even mediocre quality will be able to hear Lisa relative to her in the player's position, meaning as you cross the threshold of where she stood, it will sound as though she's in your head, and as you proceed, she will sound as if she's behind you. What's even more interesting is that if you turn around back to where she stood, she won't appear and kill you as she would in other instances later in the game. Meaning anyone who was curious enough to try this on their first run is surely not going to be spoiled on how turning around to where Lisa could be is usually punished. This moment's brilliant because now the player is feeling completely baffled as to what the ghost is even doing. It's a great way of establishing unease without disrupting the pacing. On top of that, it's possible that even the most cocksure players will be perceiving her as a non-threat and proceeding without any sense of caution, making them more open to what Lisa could potentially do. Following this is the loop where we're given the flashlight. Once we pick it up, the door is slammed on us and we're locked in the bathroom. After some investigation, we find a living fetus in the sink that is struggling and crying. The ambiance immediately picks up and we hear a door opening from the hallway outside. Footsteps approach the bathroom doorway as the baby begins to cry even louder. The handle turns, but for one reason or another, it doesn't open. It's never suggested outright, but given all we've seen up to this point, the player will almost certainly assume that the one trying to open the door must have been the ghost. And they would actually be right.
The sound of the lobby door opening and footsteps coming our way before stopping right by the bathroom door, with whatever is out there seemingly trying to get in. Because all of this plays out through the clever use of sound and vague implication, it might be safe to assume that of course there's nothing actually out there. However, by moving the camera to the hallway during this event, which would never normally be possible, we discover that this is not at all the case. Please don't mind if I show this from a variety of angles, as I was so shocked to discover this scene, I couldn't help but take the time to capture it from every possible perspective. And so we're able to see the attention to detail that went into creating this wholly unseen moment, complete with bespoke animations for Lisa that are never used elsewhere.
Lance McDonald's investigations of PT actually revealed that Lisa was in fact the one trying to get into the bathroom. This moment definitely exists to convey to the player that Lisa is no longer just screwing with us, she's coming for us. Shortly after this, we enter one of my favorite moments in the game. The player will begin hearing the same radio broadcast they heard at the start of the game, except it isn't quite the same. There's a much more pervasive static, and at certain points there will be radio interference, from the same speaker as the initial broadcast, speaking subliminally to the listener. This alone is perplexing, but eventually he speaks directly to the player, telling them to
Look behind you.
And if you do, well, you may or may not regret that. I say may, because it's actually possible that you'll turn around and not be punished for it. Regardless, this is a great way for the game to directly convey to the player that the systems in place recognize turning around as a decision that can, and in many cases will, be punished. There's also a short instance in the very loop prior to making the turn into the foyer where you can see Lisa's shadow being projected before your flashlight. The first time I noticed this, I assumed that the flashlight, having just been introduced, would serve as some sort of mechanic that allowed me to spot where Lisa might be. However, once I moved the flashlight slightly to my right, it dawned on me. Her shadow is moving relative to my back's positioning. That was, of course, my own deduction, but as it eventually turned out, Lance McDonald's investigation into PT actually revealed that Lisa's character model was physically placed behind the player.
As we turn to look, the shadow seems to also move to the side. and any investigation suggests that nothing is really there. Interacting with the framed photo in the lobby causes this phenomena to come to an end,
Shot to death in the same street last month, and in December last year.
and the shadow never reappears after this. More interesting though is that this is much more than just some cheap trick played for scares. Of course, the suggestion here being that the ghost has begun to follow us, all the while avoiding being seen. But if we apply a small patch to the game engine, making it impossible for our facing direction to be properly tracked, we can turn around and discover whether there's really anything there. So indeed Lisa is actually behind us through the entirety of this particular haunting. And there she remains until we interact with the lobby photo frame, at which point she instantly disappears.
Who was shot in the stomach was 204-863. Seen after neighbors called 911 found the father in his car listening to the radio. Several days before the murder, look behind you. I said, look behind you.
We now have two choices, to press onward or turn around. As you surely know, we have to proceed. However, if you do turn around, you'll more than likely be punished for it. So one way or the other, either in this instance or by listening to the radio, this section of the game conveys to the player that you are at your safest when you're making progress and moving forward, and that it is a major risk to be turning around. What's interesting is how you're not guaranteed to be caught by Lisa here even if you do turn around. This would almost seem to indicate that there is some degree of leniency regarding the puzzles, implying that if you happen to be misled, or not initially understand something, you aren't guaranteed to be punished for it. Of course, most of this is unlikely to be recognized in a single first-time playthrough, primarily due to the level of stress most players would be feeling, but the systems are definitely there and offer some degree of accomplishment to the more perceptive players, as well as just enough guidance for any player that may or may not be completely lost at this point. So now that the player has been presented with what is essentially the #1 rule for handling puzzles, move forward and don't turn around, the game can really start having its fun. At this point, players who have been paying attention will have a basic grasp of the systems in place, but not enough knowledge of the game as a whole to have it completely figured out. Players who haven't been paying attention will be completely lost and punished for their inability to deduce the game's mechanics. That's not a slight to those players, by the way. The vast majority of people don't have a single clue what's going on with this game their first time through, myself included. It took me ages for me to figure out that the blue cross on the picture was telling me to gouge it out by pressing the X button. Anyways, from this point onward, when the game begins to implement new and successful scare tactics, it will either throw the more cautious players off guard, or, in regards to players that are already lost, they'll be left in a state of even greater disorientation. The game is now in a place where it has established a firm grip over the player's perception, and it can begin to play with that perception as it sees fit. Another important aspect of the atmosphere to keep in mind is lighting. Lighting is a simple and effective way for the developer to influence the mood of a scene or level in any game, and it's used to great effect in PT. When we first start the game, there's almost a sense of warmness to the lighting. All the lights are on and everything's fine, although there is an air of creepiness thanks to the pitch blackness of the night just outside the window that even the light from the house is barely able to make a dent in. As things begin to pick up and become more paranormal, the lights begin to turn off one at a time so as to visually convey to the player that they are quite literally descending into the darkness. Things don't stop there, though.
Alright, well, consider this pair of pants officially ruined.
This is probably my favorite section in the entire game. I'll go over the puzzle itself in more depth later on, but that's not to say there isn't a load to discuss here in regards to the overall presentation, as if that wasn't already apparent. This moment, for me at least, was just as memorable as the first time I walked through the first loop doorway. The immediate sense of dread is spine-chilling. Everything has been escalating slowly, but suddenly here, the game hits you straight in the face, and it's enough to stop most players in their tracks for at least a moment.
Yo! That's like fucking, Ju-on style.
Yo, these fucking ghosts, man!
No, what type of ghosts are these? Del type of ghosts.
Shut up.
Fucking chicken restaurant is right outside the door.
Like.
Oh, Minecraft, man. My balls just subtracted inside my body. I am now ballless. I mean, I am now oh, god damn. Uh-huh. What? What do you want? That's actually kind of nice.
Oh, what the hell was that? Oh boy! Oh boy! Oh boy! Oh good! Oh good! Oh, it's a trap! Oh! Oh! Why is it oozing? The eternal question burning in everyone's mind. Why is it oozing? That's gonna fall on me.
After killing his family, the father hung himself with a garden hose they had in the garage.
Ah. Okay, bye.
I hear water. Is that coming from the bathroom? That's blood! What is that? Baby! Is that a fridge?
Okay, that doesn't sound right. What is this, blood? It's gonna be like The Shining. Am I gonna get washed away? That sounds very... What is that? Ugh. Another hazard. Is that a fridge?
The starkness of the red light cutting against the shadows, the immediately heavy ambient sound that almost growls at the player, the blood spilling almost at a pace from the refrigerator that is for some reason hanging where a light once was, the radio man's back at it again, everything's just perfect. Just a goddamn knockout moment in horror. After spending so much time slowly leading us into the horror of PT at a drip pace, the atmosphere is cranked to 11, as if to say, the gloves are coming off. This is also the first instance I've been able to find in the game following Lisa's introduction, where she personally appears in a way that isn't immediately considered a fail state to the player. Earlier, she appeared to us from the upstairs balcony, but now she can appear in the hallway with us. This moment appears to be completely random as well, as I've been unable to find a reliable trigger for the event, or even a consistent period of time that it might occur. If you get too close to her, which, I mean, why would you, you'll be hit with what I can only describe as one of the greatest jump scares in any video. At this point, you're in a state of possession. I don't want to go too in-depth with the mechanic right now, but the important thing to note is that you will now hear Lisa's voice, non-stop, until either you progress or she kills you. On top of this, there will be a third footstep as you walk. There doesn't seem to be a consistent timer counting down to your death, and there doesn't seem to be a reliable trigger for it either. Even turning around doesn't seem to do anything, most of the time. With all of this going on, we've got to solve a puzzle that requires us to move the camera back and forth several times. As we know by now, turning the camera is a nerve-wracking move to make, so when we have to do it so many times while the game is being at its most oppressive and downright terrifying, you can probably see why this particular section of the game would cause the player, or at least myself, so much anxiety. It's bloody fantastic. The sense of escalation is brilliantly paced and caps off with one hell of a puzzle. This is also probably the first puzzle that will stump the majority of players, meaning that for a lot of people, you're going to be spending an uncomfortably long period of time here. We then move on to the section of the game where things begin to get really weird. The atmosphere here is immediately much more subdued. The haunting ambiance is replaced by the buzzing of the radio. We don't hear Lisa at all anymore. The hanging refrigerator is replaced by the swinging light, which is no longer creaking, and is emitting a red light that's more soft and bright compared to the one previously seen. The radio is also no longer taunting us, at least in a language most people watching this video, I imagine, are capable of understanding. The player can finally just take a moment to breathe and listen to the almost calming sounds of the radio, even if the new broadcaster is just as malevolent as the last. So after being given a moment to breathe, we then begin what I can only describe as the Bizarro segment. We move much faster here to the point of having difficulty controlling the player character. There's also a heavier and much more immediate screen blurring effect as we turn the camera. In addition, all of the paintings have been replaced by moving pictures of eyes. There's a newer ambiance that's more disorienting than impressive, and the hallway is no longer descending into a loop, but endlessly repeating on its own, with the overall design of the hallway being far more nonsensical as conveyed by the inverted locations throughout it. As you can probably tell, even though this isn't the most oppressive and dreadful atmosphere in the game, it's quite perplexing. On top of that, the player will more than likely be quite shaken given just how utterly terrifying things have been prior to this. Here we have to find a peephole in the wall, which, for anyone playing this the first time, will be pretty difficult given all that's going on and all that's happened up to this point. This makes sense given how things climaxed earlier with the Hell puzzle, and that we were given a moment of reprieve between then and now. This segment is actually capped off by a primarily auditory story beat that, provided the player has been paying even a little attention, will come as a pretty huge revelation. That revelation being the murder of a woman that we can only guess is Lisa. Once we are removed from the peephole, we see some text above it telling us, "No turning back now." The ambiance has completely dissipated, the intense motion blur is no longer there, and we're walking as we were prior to entering this hallway. What's more, if we literally do try and turn back, we'll just end up walking into a wall, meaning the only option we have is to move forward. I also found it interesting that it was just a wall here instead of a locked door, as if to imply this is the start of something new, rather than a continuation of what was. That is, of course, just some speculation on my end, but it was interesting nonetheless. Given what just happened in the bathroom from our view of the peephole, the player will be inclined to investigate further. When we do enter the bathroom, we're greeted by the fetus from before, who is now speaking to us in an unnaturally deep voice. Enough here is revealed to suggest that the player character lived in this house with a woman. Given what we just heard, with a woman being brutally murdered from within the bathroom, it's pretty clear to anyone paying attention that the player character is almost definitely responsible for the death of this woman, Lisa. I know I've already covered the story, but I feel it's important to retread that ground here, as this is a very significant moment in the game, and it sets a very particular mood for the player. This knowledge, or perhaps insinuation, flips the player's perception of Lisa over completely, and is critical in regards to understanding the story. We've just learned, or at least have been suggested to, that we're playing as the man responsible for the death of the ghost that's haunting us. Following this, we walk down the silent hall of red and eventually turn to an elongated hallway that seems to transition back to what we understand here as normal. The atmosphere itself has completely quieted down and given us pause. However, we now have to reflect on the fact that we are responsible for what happened to the angry spirit that has terrorized us within these halls, and try to make sense of the various story implications surrounding that. This definitely feels like a conclusion to the story itself, so the player will almost certainly be wondering if this is the end of the game. After making the loop once more, the silence continues, at least momentarily. After a while, the screen begins to bug out, eventually tearing. We hear the number sequence from before repeated multiple times and a baby crying. The game seems to be suggesting that things aren't quite over yet. That is, of course, until we're hit with one of several crash screens. The game then appears to restart and the player is left with nothing to make sense of. If ever there was a what the fuck just happened moment in PT, this would definitely be it. The fourth wall has now completely collapsed, and we're transitioning from what is essentially the climax of the story to the revelation of what the game is actually supposed to be. It's here that we've arrived at what I dub the truth sequence. I'll talk more about the mechanics of this part in the puzzle section, but it's important to note that this part of the game is excellent at making the player feel as though they're in the place that they're not supposed to be. After the fourth wall break that sends the player back to the concrete room, things begin to feel really alien. For starters, even though the game appears to have restarted, the player is bound to notice that they still have the flashlight, which was absent at the start of the game. Upon opening the door into the hallway, there will be no source of light aside from the flashlight and the digital clock. Up to this point, the clock has either been stuck on 23:59, or, following the Bizarro segment, turned off completely. However, if the player stays in a single loop for too long, which they have to in order to solve the final puzzle, the clock will finally turn over to midnight, at which point a bell gong can be heard and a haunting will ensue. Prior to the clock hitting midnight, the hallway is completely silent, so the sudden shift to an oppressive atmosphere is a great way of making the player feel as though they're entering a dangerous territory of sorts. There's also this weird deal with the flashlight during this sequence where it will sometimes turn green, yellow, blue, or red. To this day, no explanation of this has been found. In my honest opinion, I think it was just Koji Pro playing around with the Fox engine. It does allow for some visually distinct scares though, which can be a great way to make the game more memorable for some players. Personally speaking, the blue light is the most dreadful for me due to this unforgettably horrifying moment a few years back that I actually referenced earlier from when I was in college. On top of the weird stuff with the flashlight, there are some unique encounters with Lisa that can occur during this sequence. I'll also be going over those more in depth in the next section. There's so much going on in this sequence that makes it feel so distinct from the rest of the game, even outside the puzzle itself. It's interesting because the game itself already feels so oppressive in nature, but upon entering the truth sequence, it's as if you found a rabbit hole within a rabbit hole, and that things only get weirder and more unknowable from here. On top of being simultaneously perplexing and crushingly oppressive, the player also has to deal with what can only be described as one of the most esoteric puzzles in video game history, making the truth sequence one of the most genuinely memorable pieces of any horror game I've ever played. It's difficult to describe because of just how utterly bizarre and cut off from the rest of the game that it is, so I hope you feel as though I've done an adequate enough job at conveying the sense of atmosphere felt in this final level. On top of being utterly terrifying just on a superficial level with its surreal and photorealistic audio-visual effects, PT is constructed and paced in a way that immediately grabs the player with a tangible reality, only to drip-feed supernatural elements, which continuously escalate until finally reaching points of pure surreality. I think this has been the most fun I've had so far in analyzing this game, because the level of detail and craftsmanship on display is fascinating to piece together. Although I recognize that what scares people is ultimately subjective, I've got to say that on an objective scale, PT absolutely knocks it out of the park in sheer quality of horror direction. You can just tell that everyone who worked on this demo over at Koji Pro was having a blast. Not just Kojima and Del Toro, but everyone on staff that helped make this complete and utter masterpiece of horror. I'll be going through them all individually in my concluding piece, but for now, I just want to show as much appreciation to them as I can. Because this game truly is every bit as scary as people say it is. Once again, I want to thank you all so much for watching. I've officially completed part 3 of the essay, and to be perfectly honest, I can't believe I've even got this far. I've got something of a Da Vinci complex where I'll start something and really enjoy it, but halfway through it I'll just get bored and stop. So for me, this is a pretty big accomplishment. It's been a hugely enjoyable piece of work for me, and I've got about 4 more parts to go, meaning the conclusion of this is the halfway point, if we count the intro. Seriously, I mean it from the bottom of my heart when I say that I appreciate all of you who are viewing this, even if there are only a few of you and even just a single person found some value in it. Once again, I encourage you to leave a comment providing your thoughts so far and telling me what you think of my work. Any and all feedback is definitely appreciated, even if it's as little as clicking the like or dislike button. My name is Loveless, and as always, thanks for watching. Hello everyone and welcome back to my analysis of PT Silent Hills. My name is Loveless, and tonight we're going to be looking at the various puzzles found within PT and analyzing how they work on a mechanical level, and determining whether or not PT holds up as an actually playable horror game under scrutiny. This is going to be a difficult subject to tackle as PT takes a very unconventional approach to its gameplay design, despite how familiar it might appear at first glance. Sure, we've all probably played our fair share of first-person horror games, but when was the last time you played one that required you to speak into your microphone to solve a puzzle? When it comes to video games, the horror genre is particularly interesting because horror games usually come in the form of either a puzzle game or an action survival game, or in some cases, a combination of the two. This may sound a bit odd to anyone unfamiliar with horror games, so allow me to elaborate. When most people think puzzle game, their first thought is probably something along the lines of Tetris, Portal, or even mobile games like Candy Crush, not Resident Evil or Fatal Frame. But puzzles have been an integral aspect of the horror genre pretty much since its conception in the late 90s. You will, more often than not, find a couple of puzzles littered throughout the experience. What's more is that when you do come across a puzzle in a horror game, it'll more than likely be either physics or inventory based. Physics-based puzzles would include the likes of which you'd see in Dead Space or Amnesia: The Dark Descent, where the goal is to move certain objects in the environment a certain way whilst trying to fight off or avoid enemies. On the flip side, inventory-based puzzles are typically seen in games like Resident Evil or Silent Hill. These puzzles typically revolve around trying to get from one location to another, carrying certain key items you'll need to use to interact with a mechanism that will allow you to proceed, all the while trying to figure out what non-essential items you feel comfortable discarding to make room in your inventory for said key items. PT is a completely different game, however. There's no inventory system, and there aren't enough animations or even inputs in the game to allow for physical environmental interaction beyond very basic key events. Typical design philosophy would have the player come across a puzzle, be able to understand the solution, then try to figure out how to reach that solution using the tools made available to them. PT does just about the exact opposite. Progress is made in PT when you encounter something new in a loop. If you can't proceed through the loop door, then you need to figure out how to get it open. If you're able to loop, but nothing new is happening, then you're not making any progress either. So okay, that much is made readily apparent. You gotta keep looping and having new things happen. It's an easy to grasp goal, but the trouble for the player arises when they can't do just that. However, it's unlikely that the player, especially on a first time playthrough, will realize what the heck they even did to solve whatever puzzle they were on in the first place. Then there's the final puzzle, which I will henceforth be referring to as the truth sequence, as I did in the last video. This quote-unquote puzzle is so incredibly mind-boggling that its classification as a puzzle will forever have an asterisk next to it. So for those of you who do actually own PT and want a step-by-step guide, look no further because I'm going to be going through each and every puzzle in PT and elaborating on how they're meant to be solved in as much depth as possible. Much like when I was discussing Atmosphere, I'll be going through the puzzles sequence by sequence. This of course means I'll be starting with the game's very first puzzle that I believe almost epitomizes this game as a whole, as it managed to go under the noses of almost everyone who ever played it, both figuratively and literally. After taking the first step through the loop door, the player will realize they're trapped, a feeling that will be furthered upon as they proceed to the turn into the foyer. Now, the exit door that leads to the loop door is closed, and it appears it cannot be opened, so what the hell are you meant to do? At this point, the player will be inclined to take a look around. More than likely, they'll try and open the other doors in the house. The front door is locked, the bathroom door is locked, and the prior loop door is locked. However, once the player comes back into the foyer, they'll of course see that the exit door is now opened. You may have noticed a certain cockroach moving along the floor rather lackadaisically. If you follow it as it goes, you'll eventually come across a broken photo frame on the ground. Of course, the player doesn't need the cockroach to see the photo as it's hidden rather in plain sight, but the roach does exist for anyone who picks up on it. Within the broken frame is a chalk writing R3, which any PlayStation player will recognize as the input for clicking the right analog stick. It's not necessary to press the right stick to observe the photograph, as being close enough to it alone will trigger the opening of the exit door, but it does serve as something of a tutorial for anyone who maybe didn't try pressing every button once they started the game up. It's such a basic, yet somehow completely organic concept for a tutorial puzzle, and yet it's so eloquently subtle that, like most things in PT, it would go completely under the players' noses. Mind you, that's not an insult to the players. I actually only just saw this frame for the first time on a recent playthrough I was doing purely for test footage. Another important note to make of this is that the photograph on the ground here is actually the photo of Lisa, as if to imply the answers lie in her. However, that is purely my own speculation. I call this puzzle the hidden tutorial. It accomplishes a decent amount despite doing so little that I can't help but be impressed by it despite how simple and bare bones it actually is. It's not so much the concept as it is the execution, much like many things in PT. Moving on, our next puzzle is presented in a similar fashion. As the player approaches the loop door, it'll suddenly close on them. Most people will of course try to open said door, but it's locked. It's then that the player hears the creaking of a door opening behind them. As the player turns to investigate, they begin to hear a baby moaning from within the bathroom. At this point, the only input the player will have learned, aside from pausing or opening the PS4 dashboard itself, is R3, which zooms the camera in. Given that there is a sound coming from within the bathroom and the doors creak just enough for the player to see inside, the only thing to do is peek inside and get spooked. The exit door then opens and the player can proceed. I call this the peek, and it does a fair job of allowing the player to piece together what they're supposed to do for themselves. The player should, at this point, know the one input of R3, and there might as well be a bright neon sign pointing towards the bathroom saying, "Look inside." So it doesn't take a great deal of deduction to figure this one out. Overall, a pretty decent second puzzle. So far, so good. The next puzzle, which I have labeled the locked bathroom, is probably the first puzzle that really stumped some people. Upon entering the bathroom and picking up the flashlight, the door will be slammed shut behind the player. At this point, the player will of course feel prompted to look around and will inevitably take a look into the sink. But even when things have quieted down, the player will be unable to open the door. This will of course prompt the player to look around some more and even try interacting with the environment using the R3 input. Inevitably, the player will think to look into the mirror, and upon zooming in towards the bathroom door's reflection, it'll finally crack open, allowing the player to open it fully and proceed through the next loop. This puzzle is a bit scripted because you have to wait for specific key events to play out, such as Lisa trying to open the door and the haunting to end. Credit where it's due, though. This is the first puzzle that requires the player to think outside the box, and it also just makes for a really good set piece, ramping up the tension and atmosphere and frightening the player. Pretty much everyone I've seen play PT was extremely anxious to get the hell onto the next loop once they finally escaped the bathroom. I also think that the pure visual of the player having to look into the mirror at the door frame to unlock it is something that will stick with the player throughout the experience as they try to solve more and more esoteric puzzles. The following is probably the most infamous outside of the truth sequence, and I'll be describing it as the look behind you puzzle for reasons that should be quite apparent at this point. In this loop, following the locked bathroom, the player will turn into the foyer and hear the radio playing the same broadcast from earlier, only this time with random interference from the same guy delivering a number of subliminal messages. The exit door is open, however, so the player will more than likely think that this is nothing and that they can proceed. However, anyone playing will quickly notice that nothing has changed except for the exit door now being closed. This is a pretty clear indicator to the player that they need to do something in order to proceed. Naturally, the player's attention will be drawn to the radio on the counter. The broadcaster will of course tell the player to look behind you in a very threatening tone, which should convey to the player to do just the opposite. And of course, if the player does turn around and get caught by Lisa, the punishment will serve as a clear indicator that they screwed up. So if the player is not supposed to turn around from the radio, then obviously that means they're on the right track of solving the puzzle. Of course, anyone who takes a moment to examine the counter will pick up on the photograph, and anyone with an eye for detail will notice that something's changed about it. Now there's a big blue cross and a note saying to gouge it out. Anyone remotely familiar with the DualShock controller will then think to press the corresponding button, thus solving the puzzle and allowing them to proceed. This is definitely the first puzzle that really stumped a number of players, and it is admittedly pretty obtuse. To use Soapy Warpig as an example again, it took her nearly 10 whole minutes to figure this puzzle out, and she didn't have any kind of guide to look up. She was certainly collaborating with friends, mainly throughout the course of the truth sequence, but from what I can tell, she didn't have anyone telling her the solution. She just happened to look at the picture and figure it out for herself.
Gouge it out. Oh! Okay. Well, it only took about 20 minutes.
Hell, PewDiePie basically did it by accident.
What is that sound coming from? Oh god.
Scene after neighbors called 911 found the father in his car listening to the radio.
Oh my god.
Several days before the murder, look behind you. I said, look behind you.
No. No.
Strange spell. There was another family shot to death in the same last month, and in December last year,
thank god.
a man used a rifle and meat cleavers to murder his entire family.
Oh my god. Oh god, what happened? I didn't mean to poke her eye out. I swear to god it wasn't me. Oh my god, she's even prettier now.
Next up is the final puzzle of the game prior to the truth sequence, which you may remember me describing as the hell puzzle in a prior video. If the gouge it out puzzle was the first to stump players momentarily, then the hell puzzle would be the first wall that people came across. At this point, the player will definitely have noticed the writing on the wall in the foyer saying, "I can hear them calling to me from."
Wait a second.
I want to tell you I'm hell. What? There's no way. What's he talking about? If he really was L, he'd never admit to it. I thought this guy was a bit strange, but this is pretty extreme.
And upon realizing they're stuck in the hell loop, they'll be prompted to investigate the environment as they have with previous puzzles. It'll more than likely take a few minutes of looking around, but inevitably the player will come across the writing on the corner next to the phone saying, "Hello." It's at this point that the player will more than likely realize what the goal of the puzzle is, but even if they don't, they will inevitably come back to it whilst investigating, as it is a rather noticeable change in the environment. When the player inevitably returns, they will notice that a letter is missing. At this point it should have clicked. Looking away and looking back to the hello message will cause letters to disappear. If it's not clear to the player at this point where those letters have been going, then again, they will inevitably see the letters having moved to the foyer wall just by briefly looking around. One way or another, even if the player is aimlessly looking around the environment with absolutely no clue what is going on, they will almost definitely notice the hello message and how its letters seem to disappear. I hope I'm not coming off as patronizing here. I'm only trying to explain this in as much depth as possible because, as stated, this was the first puzzle that really stopped people in their tracks. It's also an extremely tense moment, as described in the atmosphere video, so the player will definitely be more prone to error here than at any point prior. On that note, something else that's important to note here is that this is the first puzzle with an actual fail state that forces the player to restart in a new loop. That is, of course, barring the potential fail state of Lisa capturing you. This is a more mechanical failure that forces you to retry in a successive loop rather than being outright attacked by Lisa. If the player looks away from the hello writing and then looks back, a letter will be moved to the foyer. Once the letters H-E-L-L have been moved, the player looks away from the remaining characters and back once more, the O and exclamation point will both disappear, and the foyer writing will remain incomplete, forcing the player to re-loop. This was a smart move by the designers, because it's more than likely that the player will look back to ensure each letter that they need has been moved. Once the player has a grasp of how this puzzle works, they should be able to figure out pretty easily what the word is that needs to appear in the foyer. So for the player to look back once more after getting the 4 characters they already needed, just makes sense to punish them for. So once the player has caused the appropriate letters to disappear, all that's left is to check the writing in the foyer, at which point the player will be met with the laughter of Lisa as well as the unlocking sound of a door. So those are all the puzzles in the game prior to the truth sequence that are required to progress. However, there is one more puzzle that's actually completely optional. Throughout various loops, while investigating, the player will more than likely zoom in on one of several key locations that contains a torn piece of a photograph. There are 6 in total, 2 on the right side of the hallway, one being on the plant and one being beneath the digital clock, one on the floor in the corner to the right of the phone counter, one between the bathroom and the foyer in the corner on the ceiling, one in the steps leading to the loop door, and finally, one in the pause menu. Yes, in order to completely solve this puzzle, you have to go into the pause menu, click the R3 input, and watch as the camera zooms in on a brain scan. The pieces of this picture come together to form a complete photograph of Lisa prior to the events of PT. Upon finding each piece of the puzzle, you'll see various texts of various languages appear briefly on the screen that, when put together, form a complete piece of writing. I already went over this in more depth in the story video, but to reiterate briefly, the complete message in English reads as,
I whispered your name, but the wind of the night took your voice away. I didn't move anymore during the waiting. Then his finger slipped on my hand. It was a cold hand. Body was trembling. Never moving a step, his hand in mine. I waited for it to pass. And through the mist of fading consciousness, I believed I heard a phone.
So that's it. That's every puzzle in the main game of PT. Now comes the fun part, the truth sequence. This puzzle is unlike any other because there's literally nothing to suggest what the solution is, and it has nothing to do with the story of PT. Everything else prior to the collapse of the fourth wall was in some way telling a story that could be pieced together, but from this point on the focus is the reveal of Silent Hills. This is easily one of the most infamous puzzle sequences I've ever seen in a video game, and without a guide it really does seem something like a roll of the dice. Soapy Warpig was the first person on record to ever solve it, and she spent over an hour just fumbling around with zero idea of what to do and no guide whatsoever. She was collaborating with friends, of course, but they were as completely clueless as she was, as anyone was. I've watched her stream of the game twice at this point, and even though I know what generally needs to be done, I still have no idea how in the hell she managed to figure it out. For the longest time, there was no refined solution to the truth sequence, and depending on where you looked, you would find a variety of discrepancies between different guides. One guide might tell you that you have to interact with the radio, while another would tell you to stand before the writing in the foyer. Some speculated that the various colors emitted by your flashlight were indicative of different solutions, and don't even get me started on what it was that had to be said into the mic to get that second baby laugh. Speculation on this included Jay, Jareth, Jack, Lisa, Hello, Help Me, Kojima, Silent Hills, 204863, and the list goes on and on and on. So here's my solution to the final puzzle of PT. I have played PT countless times over the years, especially when it first launched, and this is the solution that I have had 100% success rate with, so it appears to be an alright method. I'm not ignorant to the fact that those of you who've looked into this rabbit hole of insanity have probably heard this statement a number of times. However, this is the method that works between me and my friends in all of our different PlayStations, every single time that we've attempted it. Upon entering the corridor of the truth sequence, I approach the halfway point of the hall approximate to the digital clock. This isn't required, but I generally do it so that after taking the proper number of steps I end up as close to the phone as possible. Here I stand perfectly still facing forward until the clock strikes midnight. Once it is midnight, a haunting will begin. I stand perfectly still until the haunting eventually subsides, and proceed to take 10 steps forward, pressing the analog stick softly so as not to step too far. It's also extremely important that you have a headset on, or you have no other sound in the room, because you are going to need to make sure that you take exactly 10 steps, not a single one more, not a single one less. Turning will also make this an extremely difficult process and require you to repeat in another loop. After 10 steps, I stop next to the phone and the first baby laugh is triggered. At this point, I speak into my mic. Although it's my assumption that you are technically supposed to speak into the mic whilst near the phone, I never actually face the phone because I find it more difficult to make accurate steps while turning. It's possible, but it's really, really difficult. Furthermore, I have done this whilst facing away from the phone, and it has worked when doing so. Anything I say into the mic seems to work the majority of the time, and I've never really failed at this step so long as I am talking enough. I've also read from countless people that they just start saying whatever the hell they can think of, or they'll be having a conversation with another person in the room and it works for them almost every time. I honestly don't believe you're supposed to say anything specific because I've done the steps so many times and said so many different things over the years, and nothing has ever worked with a 100% success rate. So basically I just ramble like a madman. After speaking into the mic, the second baby laugh is triggered, and it's at that point that I stand completely still and do absolutely nothing. Some have speculated that you need to brush your finger across the DualShock 4's touchpad, however this is not the case. You just have to stand completely still while the controller vibrates and the haunting ensues. After a few seconds, the controller will stop and the final baby laugh will be triggered. At this point the phone will ring, and I turn towards it and interact using the R3 command. Even if there's a haunting going on, it will immediately shut down and you'll be free to move out of the loop. And that's it. That's the solution to the truth sequence. At least, my solution. I'm going to take this time to address some criticism that has been directed towards this puzzle over the years, as I feel there is a great deal of misunderstanding surrounding it. Please note that I'm not saying you're wrong for disliking the puzzle. Frankly, it's clear as day just why anyone wouldn't. Just that I think a clearer understanding of its purpose and the design philosophy behind it would perhaps help people come to a more objective understanding of it. First and foremost, I believe that the truth sequence is there to act as something of a post-game level, in that it takes place outside the story of PT and has no connection to what seems to happen within the rest of the game. Narratively speaking, it isn't acting as a blocking point that prevents the player from progressing, nor is it comparable to a progress halt in a full-priced game, as PT was just a free demo. This is in no way similar to, say, the Bed of Chaos in Dark Souls, where the game just completely falls apart and potentially ruins a person's experience. Sorry, I just had to get in a shot. Now, if Silent Hills were to have been completed and released as a full-priced game, and this type of sequence were to exist in the main story path, that would be a major problem. However, if it existed as a mysterious side puzzle, or even as a post-credits gameplay sequence, then I think it would actually fit in well, because then it wouldn't feel like something that was just stopping the player from proceeding. That's not a deflection of criticism, mind you. I just want to make it clear that I think there's a very important distinction to make between utterly absurd puzzles that halt progress in the main story of a game that you spend a lot of money on, versus what is debatably optional content in a completely free experience. To further elaborate, I don't consider it a bad thing that in order to access some of the secret endings in Silent Hill 2, you will more than likely have to look up how to do so, as the methods to do so are pretty well hidden and obscure. Even the two most commonly seen endings of Silent Hill 2 require rather subtle steps to achieve, but they fit perfectly within the narrative that Silent Hill 2 is aiming for, which is something that, were we to be fair, should be considered for PT as well. PT was ultimately intended to serve as the reveal for Silent Hills, and Kojima wanted the final sequence to be as difficult to solve as possible so that those who cracked the case would have earned it. One could easily argue, of course, that since the puzzle only took a few hours to solve, that it failed in that regard. However, I don't believe that to be the case when I examine the steps that are actually required to solve the damn thing. Or at least, seemingly required. Whether or not PT was solved in 1 hour, half an hour, 1 week, or a month doesn't really make a difference. frankly, there were loads of people playing it, so it was only a matter of time before even a single person figured it out, regardless of how utterly absurd the solution was. Kojima himself said he was surprised at how quickly players managed to figure it out, thinking it would take at least a week to do so. I don't consider it a failure on PT's part that its intentionally obtuse final sequence was solved so quickly. I consider it a rousing success on behalf of Soapy Warpig that she managed not only to do so, but to be the first to ever do it. Kojima said rather clearly that he wanted PT to rally players from around the world to solve a mystery, and it's inarguable that it managed to do just that. It accomplished exactly what it was aiming for. Alright, so with all of that said, is the truth sequence a good puzzle? Well, by conventional standards, no. The answer is a plain no. The player is completely oblivious to what the goal of the puzzle even is, and the solution itself is still being debated over half a decade later. Were I to encounter this in a full-priced game, and were it to prevent me from making story progress, then I would completely pan it for being an incompetent and poorly thought-out way of just halting the player's progress, and all but requiring third-party assistance to figure out within reason. That being said, when considering that this took place within a free demo that was intended to make people work together to solve a puzzle, it must be said that it was a rousing success, and it has become something of a legend in the horror gaming community as far as cryptic puzzles go. It works as intended within the product it exists in. If the reveal of the new Silent Hill title being directed by the likes of Kojima and Del Toro, with the support of the original Team Silent and Junji fucking Ito starring Norman Reedus, had been hidden behind a very conventional puzzle that was easy to solve, then the actual solving of it would have been far less satisfying as a result. The conversation would have ended very quickly, and PT would have been considerably less memorable because of it. Now, that's not to say that PT itself, prior to the final puzzle, was ultimately forgettable. Clearly the opposite was the case, but I don't think anyone would argue that the truth sequence is something that has stuck with people for years now. In my personal experience, when I bring PT up in a conversation, most people immediately go to the final puzzle as a point of reference. Not because it's bad, but because it stood out in their mind as something that defined the experience, regardless of their personal feelings towards it as a puzzle. I think the truth sequence is a fascinating piece of an otherwise incredible game, and there's definitely a conversation to be had about it regarding design philosophy and how puzzles work in video games. This has, of course, just been my 2 cents on the subject, but I'm very curious to hear what others may have to say regarding it as well. I also want to make it clear that I don't consider myself a puzzle game aficionado by any stretch. The only puzzle games I've ever put a great deal of time into were Portals 1 and 2, and Catherine. Aside from that, there is of course horror games that consist primarily of puzzles like the old school Resident Evil and Silent Hill games, or Amnesia: The Dark Descent. But I'm not going to postulate that just because I got the Platinum Trophy for RE2 and 3, or that I'm working on the Platinum Trophy for Catherine Full Body, that I'm some kind of puzzle-solving genius. Furthermore, when I first played PT, these puzzles went completely over my head. It took me hours to beat this game. I know I just spent the last while explaining the solutions to each puzzle, and how the game subtly suggests in many areas what the player is intended to do, but that is not to insinuate that not being able to recognize the design, let alone on a first playthrough, is in some way a failure on the player's part. PT was designed with the intent of being extremely esoteric and difficult to get a firm understanding of. This way, players who couldn't figure out the puzzles would discuss their findings with one another on the internet. This sort of design is highly reminiscent of the pre-internet days of gaming, where games like Metal Gear Solid or The Legend of Zelda had puzzles, levels, and even boss fights that would cause players to have to stop and talk about it with their friends, rather than having a readily available guide just a Google search away. Of course, this no longer applies as the game has existed long enough for solutions to exist all over the internet, but the original experience will always be remembered by those who participated. So anyways, that about does it for the puzzles of PT. I've really started to get into the groove when it comes to writing all of this and editing these videos, so I'm feeling pretty good about the progress I'm making, and I sincerely hope my work reflects what I put into it. I know that the audio in the first video was not good, to say the least, but hey, I think I've come a pretty good way. This is also my first time really explaining the mechanics of video game puzzles in a professional format, so I'm eager to see the reception, especially since I'm, like I said, not a puzzle game aficionado by any sense. Thank you all once again for the support. The next video will probably be quite shorter and more fun and speculative than mechanical and objective, so I hope you're all looking forward to it and the discussion about the radio. But until that time comes, my name is Loveless, and those were the puzzles of PT. Hello everyone and welcome back to my analysis of PT Silent Hills. My name is Loveless and tonight we're going to be taking a look at what I find to be one of the more interesting and generally less discussed aspects of PT, that being the radio and its various broadcasts. This section is going to primarily be a speculative piece, so I hope you forgive me for being less concrete in my analysis here, but honestly this might just be the most difficult to understand piece of the puzzle that was Silent Hills. Also, much like in the story section of this essay, I will be going into certain topics some may find difficult to talk about, as they are somewhat political in nature. This, however, will have less to do with the story itself, and more so how Kojima has presented his beliefs in games prior to and post-PT, and how I'm able to observe that as a member of his core audience. First things first, who the hell did they pick to voice this role? Because my god, this performance is outstanding, and whoever it was absolutely knocked it out of the park. But unfortunately, they're not credited.
Retrieved the rifle and shot his wife as she was cleaning up the kitchen after lunch. When his 10-year-old son came to investigate the commotion, the father shot him too. His 6-year-old daughter had the good sense to hide in the bathroom, but reports suggest he lured her out by telling her it was just a game.
The broadcaster comes off as astute and exudes a strong confidence, but it's very off-putting when the guy starts referring to the little girl as having the good sense to hide in the bathroom, and how neighbors called 9/11. This guy switches from a schlocky Alex Jones parody to a sinister, almost Charles Manson-style cult leader vibe in an instant when comparing the standard broadcast to the radio interference. There's also just the slightest hint of vocal fry that hints to a certain degree of apathy to the stories he's reporting, further cementing the idea that this guy's a massive dick. And as if he wasn't enough of a dick already, he even taunts the player by goading them to look behind you. Well, any guess at who the voice actor might be is a complete shot in the dark, so I'm going to take that shot.
Taking hostages has been a part of human history since human history began. Oklahoma City.
You taking a trip, Wes?
And shot his wife as she was cleaning up the kitchen after lunch.
I want you to take that 9mm out of your belt and put it in the van, slowly.
The Trade Center bombing.
I'm gonna give you 15 seconds to run for your life.
I said, look behind you.
876.
863.
876.
No.
863.
Kind of scary on this end of the rifle, isn't it, Wes?
There's a whole new level of bad guy out there. A very complicated and dangerous and intelligent and prepared enemy.
You know, Wes, at least the people that you murdered died with their dignity.
I got a message for all you folks out there in Radio Land. But in the last 15 years, there have been some big changes.
Meet David Caruso, well-renowned actor who first appeared in the 1980 film Getting Wasted, and eventually went on to become the leading man on the hit TV series CSI Miami, which went on for about 10 seasons, towards the end of which he was making as much as $375,000 per episode. Caruso had been nominated for a Primetime Emmy and even won himself a Golden Globe for his role on NYPD Blue. When CSI Miami ended in 2012, he retired from the world of acting and went on to pursue his interests in the art business. From what I can tell, the guy seems to be enjoying his retirement and pretty much doing whatever he wants. With all of that free time, especially in the immediate years of his retirement, who's to say he wasn't approached by a few casting agents? And who's to say he didn't say yes to at least one of them, especially if that something involved venturing into an entirely new artistic medium? Now okay, let me be clear. I'm not here to spread rumors, and I am not saying this happened. I am, however, saying that the possibility of it is there, and given that his voice is identical to the man on the radio, I'm inclined to raise an eyebrow at the potential reality of the situation. For now, this is the best I've got. Honestly, if I ever met Kojima, Del Toro, or anyone that ever worked on PT, my first question would be, who the hell's the man on the radio? So let's go through each of the radio broadcasts and try and make sense of what's going on here. The first broadcast references a congressional debate over gun control flaring up yet again and proceeds to discuss a series of horrific familicides, suggesting that even though the crimes are unrelated, they may be a part of some rising trend onset by a number of social issues. This is an obvious mirror to a certain real-world trend of crimes that had become quite prevalent in the US by the time of the game's conception. It's important to note that this is a common practice in the horror genre, and until it becomes a direct reflection, or worse, outright parody of real-world events, that it shouldn't be considered exploitative, as the connection won't necessarily be made by everyone. Evidence of this being that the game didn't get utterly lambasted by critics for doing just that. and the subject material is still being taken quite seriously. Another example of a work of horror that engaged in this practice is the first Nightmare on Elm Street film, which was heavily inspired by the stories of Asian refugees from Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam who suffered from horrific nightmares and eventually died in their sleep. During the conception of Freddy Krueger, Wes Craven actively avoided characterizing him as a child molester because he understood that the character didn't need that added onto his mountainous pile of crimes, and to do so would have been nothing but exploitative at that point. I admit, it's difficult to pinpoint the exact moment when something becomes exploitative, and obviously anyone can have gripes with any kind of material, depending on the subject matter that it covers. But isn't that kind of the point of horror? To make the audience feel uncomfortable and feel anxious? PT succeeds in this regard because, like so many things in the opening minutes of the game, it serves to help immerse the player in the world of the game by making it feel more real and actualized than it otherwise would. But this doesn't just apply to anyone up to date on the news in the US. Anyone is capable of recognizing that familicide is an utterly horrific and appalling crime. When I was young, I wasn't familiar with the horror stories of what Asian refugees faced during their time in hiding, but I didn't need that in order to understand that dying in your sleep is utterly terrifying. The stories of the Asian refugees adds context, but it isn't necessary to be scared or made uncomfortable even by the film, so credit to PT for maintaining respect for its subject matter. The same, however, most certainly can't be said for This Man on the Radio. The man shows absolutely no respect for the victims of the crimes he's covering. Most news anchors wouldn't be so callous as to break up the tension of their report by referring to the little girl who was murdered as having the good sense to hide in the bathroom. He isn't being an outright asshole, but there's enough sour notes sprinkled into the man's monologue that anyone can get the impression that he is a pretty unlikable guy. It's pretty obvious that this character is intended to be a parody of conspiracy theorist personalities, which saw a shift into the mainstream media coverage and popularity around the early 2010s, the same time that Silent Hills was being conceptualized. Conspiracy theories have always been commonplace in the mass media, of course, and Kojima was obviously no stranger to them. More specifically, in the early 2010s, conspiracy theories were seeing something of a resurgence in popularity, to the point that entire conspiracy theory networks, such as InfoWars, were seeing something of a renaissance in viewership and followers. Conspiracism was also beginning to leak into the world of gaming, with channels such as Feminist Frequency suggesting that game studios were often seeking to undermine and demean women, people of color, and various divisions of the LGBT through subtle design choices in their games. Conspiracism was running rampant and beginning to become relevant to the world of gaming, so it makes sense that Kojima, who has always had an interest in the subject, would consider using it in his next potential title. Moving on to the Look Behind You puzzle, we hear the same broadcast that was heard in the first loop, but this time there's some discrepancies. There's a very prevalent static noise that fluctuates in intensity. When the static hits a peak, the broadcast will cut to the same man on the radio delivering subliminal messages such as "You can't trust the tap water," and repeating the infamous number sequence 204863. At this point, it's pretty well decided by the Silent Hill community that the number itself is nothing more than a reference to Kojima's birthday, and really, there isn't anything else I feel it could reasonably be, so I'm just going to leave it at that. One thing that is plainly clear, however, is that the man on the radio seems to have some sinister ulterior motives. The fact that it's him speaking during these peaks in static, and that his tone of voice has shifted to something much more sinister, and even commanding, strongly implies that he was perhaps trying to get his viewers to obey him for reasons that aren't exactly what we in the intellectual world would call good. The man's clearly plotting something, but due to Silent Hills' cancellation, we'll never quite know it for ourselves. The subliminal messages seem to be planting seeds of doubt in the viewer, though, which is something that will develop in the next broadcast. The man says not to touch the dial and that we're just getting started, conveying to the hypothetical viewer that this is not something they should miss out on. However, the tone is extremely threatening, as if to imply, if you don't listen, you're going to be in trouble, when really the opposite's true. If you turn around when he tells you to, you'll more than likely be attacked by Lisa. The man's gone from being insensitive to victims of crimes to being an outright dick to the player. There's another much smaller radio transmission not long after the Look Behind You puzzle, when you first see the fridge hanging where the light once was. In this transmission, you hear the same guy from before saying the following.
After killing his family, the father hung himself with a garden hose in the garage.
Of course, if you listen carefully, you'll hear something else beneath this saying,
With a garden hose in the garage.
It appears to be the same voice as the prior radio broadcast, but modified to sound deeper. There are some implications here, but nothing really concrete. If we are to assume that the starting room is supposed to represent an actual room in the house, the only room that really makes sense is the garage. If that were to be the case, then it would explain why we start the game in that room and why we return there when we're killed by Lisa. Possible further evidence of this is how Lisa seems to target our neck specifically. This would also cause us as an audience to, had we not already thought to at this point, question whether or not our player character was even alive or not. Did the garden hose fail to get the job done? Are we perhaps in some sort of limbo between life and death where some of what we see is from the living world and others from the realm of the dead? That would certainly seem to fall in line with the happenings of Silent Hill. It's impossible to say for certain though, but it's certainly fun to explore, and I think there is some sort of implication here to suggest that the starting room is in fact meant to represent the garage. After all, the layout of the house isn't meant to make complete sense, as discussed previously. However, subtle and vague design choices are there so we can make inferences of our own, rather than definitive statements and conclusions, so I'll leave it up to the viewer what the deal with the starting room is, and whether or not the broadcast does pertain to the player character. After the Hell puzzle, we encounter another broadcast that is easily the most interesting of the bunch. The entire broadcast is delivered in Swedish, and translates as follows.
Close your eyes. Let your ears listen to the radio. Can you hear my voice? Can you hear your own soul scream? Let us choose. My voice that tells the future, or your tortured mind? Well, what do you choose? You can choose. Your life, your future. Wise as you are, you might already have discovered it. Yes, the radio drama from 75 years ago was true. They are here on our Earth, and they monitor and see all. Don't trust anyone. Don't trust the police. They are already controlled by them. That's the way it has been for 75 years now. Only our best will prevail. You have a right to become one of us. So, welcome to our world. Very soon the gates to a new dimension will open.
Så har det varit i 75 år nu. Endast vår mästare kan hålla dem. Du har en rätt att bli en av oss. Så välkommen till vår mycket snart öppnas portarna till en ny
So there's quite a bit to unpack here. Doubling down on the idea that our main character's descent into madness included a deep dive into conspiracism, I think it's fair of me to conclude that this broadcast is meant to represent our main character's belief that not all is right with the world, all the while subtly hinting that his own mind is in fact quite damaged. The very first thing said in the broadcast is to close your eyes, let your ears listen to the radio. It's important to note that similarly to what was said by the Mad Lad Caruso in the Look Behind You broadcast, this is a direct command to the viewer. To close your eyes is to deprive yourself of one of your key senses, and to lend stronger focus to another key sense, which the radio then directly tells you to use to listen to it. Already this broadcast is suggesting that not only is the radio trying to control its viewers, but that it's trying to get the audience to rely on it. Finally, the line, "Do you hear my voice?" seems to be an attempt at focusing the viewer's attention solely on the radio. This even makes sense in the context of the game, because within this particular loop, Lisa is incapable of harming us, at least while the radio broadcast is going on. The radio then asks, "Can you hear your own soul scream?" This suggests that there is some sort of understanding that its viewers are struggling, perhaps hinting that the radio is preying on those struggling mentally, emotionally, or even spiritually. Also note how it asks "can" rather than "do." This suggests to the viewer that perhaps, if they cannot, it could be a weakness on their own part, thus leading them to seek further truth from the radio. The radio then says, "Let us choose. My voice that tells the future, or your tortured mind. Well, what do you choose?" The radio is making an illusion of choice, implying to the viewer that they very well could ignore what it's saying, but to do so would be misguided as the radio speaks with a voice that tells the future, while the viewer suffers from a tortured mind. The question, well, what do you choose, is almost condescending at this point, thus leading the viewer to believe that they'd be foolish not to listen to the radio. Also, note how it says, let us choose, not make a choice, or something else to that effect. The following line, you can choose, your life, your future, reaffirms to the viewer that it is their choice what they do. Having torn the viewer's defenses down at this point in the monologue, the radio is now helping the viewer establish an entirely new foundation, thus strengthening their trust in the radio. The radio then uses this trust to reaffirm to the viewer that they are in some way special by saying, wise as you are, you might already have discovered it. Now that the radio has re-established the psychological foundation of its viewers, it's ready to begin divulging its secrets, not unlike the methods used by cult leaders. Yes, the radio drama from 75 years ago was true. They are here on our Earth and they monitor and see all. Don't trust anyone. Don't trust the police. They are already controlled by them. That's the way it has been for 75 years now. The radio drama being referenced is the 1938 broadcast known as The War of the Worlds, where broadcaster Orson Welles directed a faux news broadcast touting that extraterrestrial life forms were invading Earth. This broadcast occurred on the night of October 30th and was simply intended to be a Halloween special. However, it soon blew up into something much more culturally significant than anyone behind it probably ever thought possible. The broadcast came under fire from other media outlets for allegedly convincing a number of viewers that aliens were actually invading. Something important to note is that the public outrage purported by the media has been highly debated over the years. So while Wells's broadcast was being touted as fake news, the very people making these reports were more than likely exaggerating things themselves. Even nearly a century ago, Americans were getting up in arms about the unreliability of the media. Ironic. Anyways, back to the broadcast in PT. The radio then goes on to tell its viewers not only that they can't trust anyone else, but it tells them not to. The radio says that's the way it has been for 75 years now, suggesting to the viewer that by now they, quote-unquote, have rooted deeply into our society. This, of course, is very relevant to our main character who is struggling to make sense of his firing, given what we know. At this point, it should be quite clear how this particular broadcast represents the psychological breakdown of our main character from his listenings of the radio. There are a couple of questions to address at this point. For starters, why is the broadcast in Swedish? Simply put, there's really no answer. It's possible that the main character, or even Lisa, descends from Swedish heritage. It's also possible that David Caruso just happened to know how to speak Swedish and Kojima thought it would be cool. There really is no answer. Sorry. Is this an actual broadcast that our main character is remembering and being faced with? Honestly, I don't think so. I think this broadcast is simply here to depict, as I've tried to present, how our main character was led to the radio and how it led to his distrust of Lisa. A distrust that unfortunately took a dark turn when he inevitably discovered the potential infidelity of his spouse. The final lines of the broadcast go as follows. Only our best will prevail. You have a right to become one of us. So welcome to our world. Very soon the gates to a new dimension will open. This is an attempt by the radio to hype up its viewers as they rally against the threat of society. This is a common practice for any speaker, whether they be legitimate leaders,
Free at last! Free at last! Thank God Almighty! We are free at last!
or psycho cult leaders.
I truly believe that if we work together, we can create a cultural shift.
Whoops. That was supposed to be a Charles Manson clip. Well, all the same. Anyways, it's a solid way to cap off any sort of passionate speech, and it leaves the viewers feeling like they have a sense of responsibility that supersedes their cultural norms. Given what we heard earlier about fathers murdering their families and the potential that this was beginning to become something of a trend, it's quite possible, given what we now know, that the radio was inciting the actions taken by these people. In fact, I think it's all but directly said to us.
Okay, listen up, and don't you move. Need to take a piss? Hold it. The show's got just 60 seconds to go, but I got a message for all you folks out there in Radio Land. So sit tight and bend an ear. Now's the time for action. Our society is rotten to the core. I'm talking to all the fine, upstanding folks got their welfare cut, got their jobs pulled out from under them. Yeah, you know what to do. Now's the time. Do it.
That was the final broadcast in PET. In the game, we don't actually hear the opening lines of it, but thanks to data miners, I'm able to present it to you in full. Given that this broadcast is given to us in the climax of what is essentially the story section of the game, it makes sense that we would be presented with a plot revelation or two, the other of course being what happened to Lisa, but more on that later. In this broadcast, we learn exactly what the man on the radio thinks of the society he lives in, and we learn that he was in fact inciting violence from his viewers. At the very least, we can confirm that the main character was in some way feeling incited by the radio, given what's going on during this broadcast. The radio in PT is a fascinating element of the story that I felt was going rather undiscussed. I scoured the internet for videos, articles, and threads discussing it, and there were certainly a handful of interesting interpretations I'd found from the fans, despite being so few and far between. Amongst these, my favorite had to be the video by Ragnarox where he discusses the possible connection between the radio in PT and the CIA Project MKUltra, where people were being brainwashed via radio broadcasts. It's a genuinely fascinating subject and perhaps something I'd want to explore in the future. For now, though, I think I'm satisfied with what I've discussed in this section of the essay. There's only one topic left for me to cover now, and that's Lisa. I can already tell that the Lisa video will probably be one of the biggest and meatiest of them all, so I'm eager to get right into it following this. After that, I'll have one more video, which will serve as the conclusion for the entire series. I want to go ahead and apologize that this video might be coming out a little bit later than I'd like. Unfortunately, I got pretty sick last week, and that took several days out of my schedule. My voice was messed up, so there was no way I was going to be able to record this and sound halfway decent. On the plus side, I was able to finish my Dead Space 4 video as well as the Layers of Fear video. Which, by the way, you should check out because, from what I've been told, my Dead Space 4 pitch was pretty good. And speaking from my own perspective, the Layers of Fear video was a blast. I really enjoyed making it. But I suppose that's enough self-promoting for now. I'm hoping to have the Lisa video out by the end of the next week, and I'm also wanting to do something special for Halloween. But until that time comes, my name is Loveless, and that was the radio in PT.
Your son. Send him on his way to heaven by your own hand. It's not too late if you act fast. You, what did you do? Right in front of everyone. I'm putting this on the news, you psycho murderer.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest in my dissection of PT Silent Hills. We're in the endgame now. Tonight we'll be discussing someone I've been very eager to discuss ever since the start of this project, and that someone is none other than Lisa. Of course, anyone who has kept up with the series to this point will know I've already talked about her at fair length, but I've tried to avoid going into too much detail, outside of the story section, for the sake of brevity and relevance. But the time for that is over, and it's high time I fully explored everything there is regarding this character. Where do I even begin? Perhaps the first thing that anyone will remember about Lisa is her physical design. When PT first launched and started gaining traction, if an article or video thumbnail didn't feature the mugshot reveal of Norman Reedus, it almost definitely had this lovely lady's face plastered all over it, and for good reason. Lisa is utterly terrifying on a visual level. Her design is simple, and yet every detail seems to convey some hint regarding what might have happened to her. She's also fairly reminiscent of spirit designs seen in other media such as Ju-On, The Ring, and even Silent Hill 4. Japanese horror has unfortunately gone under the radar for the most part in recent years. Besides Juji Ito, try naming a contemporary Japanese horror artist that has managed to break international boundaries and meet with even moderate success. For PT to not only take such an approach but revel in its creative potential was a monumental step forward in horror gaming, and I feel that the core of it all lies with Lisa. The first thing that caught me about Lisa, and will more than likely catch anyone upon seeing her in the foyer for the first time, was her inflated stomach. This is something I can't recall ever seeing in a ghost design prior to PT, and it immediately prompts a number of extremely uncomfortable questions in the player. Was the woman pregnant when she died? How far along was she? Is it the child of the player character? Is the child even still inside of her? If so, what became of it? The best part is that we'll never be able to answer any of these questions, so it's up to the minds of the players to fill in the blanks. Something that I've always found interesting about the design of Lisa is the way she limps. For the longest time I wondered why she would be limping and eventually attributed it to the developers just wanting her to be as creepy as possible, and giving her a limp was a good way to prompt questions while being creepier on a superficial level. Think about it, when was the last time you saw a ghost limping? Thanks to data mining, I was able to pick up on the single red high heel she was wearing. That, of course, prompted me to wonder, why is she wearing a single red high heel with a nightgown? A common theory I've seen discussed is the possibility that Lisa in PT could in fact be Lisa Garland herself, and that this was a deliberate hint towards just that. Lisa Garland is a character any Silent Hill fan will be familiar with, having appeared in more Silent Hill media than the majority of its characters. The possible connection between Garland and Lisa in PT are definitely there, but I'd like to take a closer look before jumping to any conclusions. For starters, they share a first name, which is uncommon for characters in any series that the writers aren't trying to draw some sort of connection between. For example, in the game Catherine, the two love interests of the main character, 3 in the full body remaster, share the first name Catherine, however one is spelled with a C and the other with a K, and a Q for the third in full body. The two characters represent different paths in life that the main character potentially desires. Catherine with a K represents order, showing us how she can make Vincent feel shackled while also providing him with comfort to lean on in times of strife. Catherine with a C is the complete opposite in that she represents unbridled freedom, allowing Vincent to just chill out and have fun while also having to deal with Catherine's complete unpredictability. You're probably wondering why I didn't use Mary and Maria from Silent Hill 2 as reference for this point, to which I have 2 reasons. 1, it felt like the most go-to reason that everyone watching this would have probably thought about, and 2, I've been playing Catherine full body quite a bit lately, so I just wanted to talk about that for a moment. It's pretty good. Anyways, the 2 Lisas here share no such dichotomy, and the parallels between them are extremely thin. The only other real similarity between the two is the red slipper, however I don't think this was unintentional. If you'll allow me to put on my tinfoil hat very briefly, I think this was almost a literal red herring from Kojima. Kojima obviously knew that once the veil was pulled away, people would start looking into PT at extreme detail, and considering his history of playing with the expectations of gamers, even when looking at PT exclusively, it's pretty apparent that he enjoys getting people to speculate even if it leads them out in completely different directions. One red high heel doesn't confirm the return of a character, let alone everything else that would entail. However, it is a fun little detail that can get some fans talking and speculating. So yeah, she wears a red slipper. She's also missing an eye, something you're not as likely to notice until she catches you herself. Something I always thought was cool was how she never actually tried to catch the player prior to the look behind you puzzle, meaning that particular loop would likely be the place most players first realized she was missing an eye. Just about any player will be able to connect the dots on this one. In the puzzle, the player has to gouge out the eye of a woman in the picture, and when they do, it looks disgusting and sounds particularly pungent. When you get a good look at Lisa's face, you can see she's missing an eye in the exact same spot you gouged from the picture. It's also a nice and subtle way of implying that the player character could be the one in fact responsible for Lisa's grisly murder. It's also worth noting that Lisa's other eye seems to be on the brink of popping out of its socket, although why this is, I can't really say. I mentioned before that the main character in Lisa appeared to have a very traditional set of beliefs, and it's possible that that could have something to do with Lisa having her eye gouged out. In the King James Version of the Bible, Matthew 5:29 reads, "And if thy right eye offend thee, pluck it out, and cast it from thee. For it is profitable for thee that one of thy members should perish, and not that thy whole body should be cast into hell." The term offend thee has been translated a number of ways, generally meaning to cause one to sin or stumble, as was commonly said in the ancient Greek. So that about does it for Lisa's physical appearance. Now I'd like to talk a bit more about her character in general. I've already discussed what happened to her in the story section, but what can we say about her as a character? One thing I feel is necessary to address, given the nature of Silent Hill, is whether or not the Lisa we encounter is just a projection of the main character's psyche, or the actual spirit of Lisa. There's definitely a debate to be had here, and while I will be working off my own assumptions, I want to make sure that I address both arguments equally. Perhaps the Lisa we encounter is in fact an illusion created by Silent Hill. Given that our main character seems to be repressing his memories, it makes sense that the source of his guilt would be used as the primary means of his punishment. It wouldn't be too much unlike what happened with Mary in Silent Hill 2, who turns into a monster upon finally being reunited with James. There's also the potential issue of her behavior regarding the child in the sink. A mother's love is forever, as they say, so perhaps her apparent apathy towards the child has more to do with how our main character feels about it rather than Lisa. There's also something to be said for how Lisa is introduced to the player in the game, if we're to work under the assumption that she is a projection of our main character's psyche. Upon first waking up, Lisa can be seen in the crack in the door. However, she closes the door and we don't see her for several loops. This would appear to indicate that somewhere in the corner of our character's mind, his guilt still exists, but he doesn't remember or know enough to immediately recognize it. As we progress, Lisa can be heard banging on the door of the bathroom with increasing ferocity, as if to suggest his guilt is trying to escape the repression of his mind. Eventually, however, we encounter Lisa, and the door to the bathroom is opened. Within the bathroom, we find the child, as well as the flashlight. It works as a means of storytelling, but before we jump to any conclusions, let's explore with a different perspective. Let's now assume for a moment that the Lisa we encounter is in fact the spirit of Lisa in the canon of PT. So, allow me to address some counterpoints to the previous argument. As I elaborated on in the story section, I think her behavior towards the child can be explained using what we understand about her character in the story. Whether the child is the offspring of the main character or her boss, whether or not it was conceived consensually, the poor little bastard is not only the root of her conflict, but the reason she's trapped in this hell that is Silent Hill. And let's face it, Lisa's no Mary Sue. She was a flawed person prior to the events of PT, even more so if we consider her having consented to an affair with her boss, though this is a less likely outcome, I find. And she's not exactly the nicest person in-game either. Plus, if you would allow me to throw in my own opinion for a moment, I don't think it would make much sense for her to act protectively towards the child, given what little we know. That being said, I understand anyone could see things differently here, and as previously stated, it's very possible that her apathy towards the child is more of a reflection of the main character's psyche than anything. There's also the issue of what Kojima himself might have been considering when conceptualizing PT. It's obvious that PT takes inspiration from a number of Japanese horror classics, many of which I've already made comparisons to, so allow me once again to examine them further. In Ju-on: The Grudge, the spirits encountered are in fact the spirits of the people that they look like. The film itself doesn't give any indication that the spirits we see are in some way projections of the inner turmoil of the other characters. It's more than likely Kojima, someone with a very strong passion for film, recognized this. Lisa's design already stems a great deal from the classic Onryo, so it makes sense that this very core element also translated into Lisa herself. The counter to this, of course, would be that those films don't necessarily pertain to the canon of Silent Hill, which typically deals with illusions of torment based on the psychological issues of its various characters. However, I would also like to point out that there are instances of monsters appearing in Silent Hill games that have been real, and not just illusions conjured by the haunted town. Although Silent Hill 1 and 3 explored psychological horror, their focus was more on the occult, meaning that several of the monsters that appeared, most notably anything going on with Alessa and Heather, were in fact real. My point here being that Silent Hill has never been tied down exclusively to projections of psychological torment. The question of whether or not Lisa is just an illusion created by Silent Hill is a genuinely fascinating one. I have no doubt many of you have your own opinions, and perhaps some thoughts I've yet to consider. In the spirit of traditional Japanese horror, I want to leave the answer to this up to the audience, and although I do have my own conclusions, I'm going to refrain from showing my hand, at least for the time being, as I feel it might taint the discussion. That being said, there will be points where I bring up certain things Lisa does in-game and what they could imply in either context, though I'll be sure to address that when it does come up. Regardless of which position is true, however, I think what separates Lisa from other vengeful spirits commonly seen in horror is that her grief is directly tied to the main character, the player character. Once the player begins figuring things out, they'll eventually realize that not only is the spirit pissed off, it's pissed off at them, which is far more terrifying as a concept. Lisa's character is in one of two mindsets by the time of PT. Either she's a projection of Silent Hill with the sole intent of tormenting you, or she remembers everything, resents the child in the bathroom, and is filled with nothing but hatred for the player character. Humoring the idea that the spirit we encounter is in fact the true Lisa, let's examine the nature of the looping hallway. It's not just you this is happening to. Lisa's stuck here as well, and unlike the player character, there doesn't seem to be an implied means for her to escape. Not only is Lisa trapped in the infinitely looping hallway reminiscent of the place where she was brutally murdered, she's trapped there with the spirit of the child she was carrying, constant reminders of her past life, and the very person responsible for her death. She's surrounded by nothing but misery and reminders of the worst and final days of her life. Her stomach is still inflated, but whether or not it's carrying anything is impossible to know. She's malformed and hideous. There is nowhere for her to go. The only possible means of joy she can experience at this point is enacting revenge on the player character. Revenge is all that remains for Lisa in this accursed corridor, and that's reflected in her smile as she torments the player. Lisa's attack has become something of a legend within horror gaming, and there are definitely a few reasons for this. Obviously, it's a great jump scare, and the build-up to it combined with the general pacing of the game is really well executed. But beyond that, you're forced to look at her face from the perspective of your character as she proceeds to brutalize you. Not only is she smiling, but she seems to be taking her time with her attack, choking the player character for several seconds before finally snapping his neck. If this is the real Lisa, then she appears to be experiencing some sort of primal joy in finally having her hands on her murderer. If this is another elaborate creation of Silent Hill, then it could be a possible reflection of what the main character feels he deserves. After Lisa snaps his neck is when things get weird. The player falls to the floor, Lisa is outside of the player's line of sight, and the camera is given a minor shake as you hear something. I'm going to be perfectly honest, I have zero clue what is happening here. There's a very distinct unzipping noise and what sounds like chewing. I know what some of you are thinking, so stop it. It's not it. On a serious note, I really can't make heads or tails of this. I tried tweeting Lance McDonald to see if he would use that camera hack of his to see for himself, and I'm still waiting for his reply. I'm sure he'll get around to it. Eventually. Anyways, following Lisa's attack, the player will be returned to the starting concrete room. However, now that the flashlight has been acquired, it'll now be possible to see the darker side of the room. Upon investigating, the player will see a bag.
Got anything new?
No.
Nothing? You're just a bagman?
Bagcoon
Bagcoon's
gone silent.
Oh, sorry. Bagcoon, sitting on the table that appears to be soaked in some sort of goop. After examining it, Bagcoon will briefly shake and begin speaking, reciting an extended version of the opening text.
I walked. I could do nothing but walk. And then, I saw me, walking in front of myself. But, it wasn't really me. Watch out. The gap in the door. It's a separate reality. The only me is me. Are you sure the only you is you?
A lot of people have speculated that the bag is some sort of representation of the player, that perhaps their head or guts or something was removed by Lisa, and that would explain the goop coming from the bag. There's also the issue of different realities and what that could potentially have to do with Silent Hills. Unfortunately, there really isn't anything else to go on regarding Bagcoon, although if I were to guess one thing that would have definitely made it to the final product, aside from the staff working on the game themselves, it would definitely be Bagcoon. If there's anything that feels underplayed in PT, it's Bagcoon. The script here has a number of pretty huge implications that connect to the very title of the project, so I'd fair to say that this was probably something Kojima wanted to explore when conceptualizing Silent Hills from the start. I will say that as far as the identity of Bagcoon goes, my theory is that it's being spawned from within Silent Hill, meant to represent another aspect of our main character. The manifestations within Silent Hill typically represent something stirring within the protagonist, so it makes sense that Bagcoon would work under a similar set of rules. He talks about doing nothing but walking, the gap in the door, and so on. And given that the player character is the only one besides Lisa, and to a lesser extent the man on the radio, that exists within the looping chasm, it makes sense for Bagcoon to be a sort of manifestation of the main character's thoughts, especially upon returning to the concrete room after being killed by Lisa. Something interesting to note, however, is that if you manage not to die and make it to the truth sequence, when you reawaken in the concrete room, Bagcoon has nothing to say. This got me thinking, what if my first death was within the truth sequence? The reason I ask is tied back to what I said earlier about the truth sequence acting as this sort of non-canonical post-game of sorts. It feels quite distinct from the rest of the game in terms of design and overall structure, so perhaps the silence of Bagcoon here actually meant something. So I decided to test this question out for myself. I booted up PT and rushed my way through the game to the truth sequence without dying. As per usual, Bagcoon had nothing to say. I then proceeded to go through the truth sequence, looping as many times as possible before finally being killed by Lisa, in a moment I found genuinely hilarious.
Hey Lisa, you're a bitch. Ah! I knew that one would get you, you motherfucker!
Fucking brilliant. Upon returning to the concrete room, however, something interesting occurred.
Okay, so I'm on the truth sequence, and I only just now got killed. I hadn't been killed, at least in this playthrough, so that means Bagcoon wasn't talking to me. Now let's see if Bagcoon will talk in the truth sequence. Oh? Oh? Hello? Bagcoon? I see you over there wrestling.
This left me perplexed. But at the same time, I couldn't help but laugh about it. What an odd little baggie. This does, however, lend some credence to the possibility that Bagcoon is in fact a manifestation of sorts to reflect the player character's frustrations with the hallway, being that he only goes into this monologue about different realities within the quote-unquote canonical section of the game. Bagcoon's silence during the truth sequence almost seems to be an indicator that the player is now in a part of the game that's completely outside of the canon, although I admit this is something of conjecture on my part. Oh, Bagcoon, how your mysteries exceed our grasp. Anyways, back to Lisa. Something I touched on earlier in the series was how Lisa appears to operate outside the rules of the game itself. In many ways, this reminds me of Ju-on, where at first we believe the spirits to be locked within the confines of the haunted house, only to later see a character running for their life within their own apartment complex, possibly several miles away from the house the spirits were inhabiting. It's a brilliant subversion of the audience's expectations that completely flips the trope of the haunted house on its head, all the while making the threat and terror of the situation far more dire. The realization that nowhere is safe once the spirits are coming for you is utterly terrifying as a concept, and this definitely seems to have served as a sort of inspiration behind the creation of Lisa. Unlike other enemies in video games, Lisa is not bound by the mechanical nature of the interactive medium. Her abilities to break the pause menu and seemingly make decisions of her own cause the player to perceive her very differently than threats they've encountered in prior games, at which point they'll begin to take her far more seriously. Lisa is unpredictable, but not in a way that detracts from the experience. There are still rules in which prevent her from outright insta-killing the player constantly or appearing in loops that she's not meant to be in. If Lisa had complete and total freedom, then that would screw with the game's overall design and pacing. The demo is quite short, meaning that you'll never lose any serious progress, and even when she does catch you, it just means restarting the loop, where you've either figured out the solution already, or you haven't. When Lisa attacks the player, it's either after a seemingly arbitrary length of time, or to punish the player for making a critical error. In both cases, it's a genuine surprise and can cap off a real feeling of anxiety, causing the player to be quite shaken, but then allow them to relax, albeit briefly. The concrete room definitely isn't cozy, but it does serve as a place of safety for the player to catch their breath. Lisa will do much more to the player than just attack and kill them, though. As previously established, her MO isn't just killing the player character, it's tormenting them. This is another important distinction from the usual vengeful spirits seen in other media, and it helps to add a bit more to her character. Samara didn't torment the protagonist in The Ring because of some deep-rooted personal animosity, at least none pertaining to the protagonist. She tormented her because she was a pissed-off spirit, and that's about it. In Ju-on, the spirits didn't have any apparent goals, they just killed people that treaded on their grounds. Sometimes. In PT, Lisa has a very understandable vitriolic hatred for the player character, and she wouldn't be satisfied with just charging you down and killing you. In fact, most of what Lisa does is just stand around. I say this, and yet the instances we see her just standing in the single spot are often some of the most tense moments in the game, I find. Take for example this moment during the truth sequence where Lisa can be seen standing outside the window. Not only does this screw with the player's understanding of the environment, as they themselves are incapable of going outside, but seeing Lisa from so close for what is likely the first time for many people while she is still shaking so violently is an extremely uncomfortable sight to behold. I remember once when I was playing with my roommate at the time. This was not long after Silent Hills had been revealed, and we saw this encounter for the first time ever, and it scared the absolute shit out of us. What made the moment even better were our completely different reactions to it. Not to throw shade at my buddy, but he was kind of a giant baby when it came to horror games, and he was the one playing, so he decided to turn tail and go for another loop. I, on the other hand, was shouting at him saying, "No, go back! I want to see if she'll do anything!" To which he turned to me and said, "Are you insane?" What can I say? I'm a curious guy. There's this other moment with Lisa that I honestly just find hilarious. After the look behind you puzzle, you go through this loop where nothing seems to be happening. You cross into the foyer when suddenly... Now, to a lot of people, this probably seems like a totally cheap jump scare with nothing of substance. However, I would argue those people most likely didn't take a moment to turn around and look up, to see for themselves where that even came from. On the second floor balcony, you can see Lisa just looking down at you with that big shit-eating grin. It might not cause you to jump, but the moment itself is extremely tense because, for the first time, you're looking at Lisa, and she's looking right back at you.
Why are you crying again? Just remember, this is 50% skill.
10% luck!
Well, you can fuck off! Oh, did the chandelier just break? Yes, it did. You can fuck right off. Look up! Look up. Focus. What happened to your focus, Kyle? Oh, shit! Oh, that's awesome! Yo! That's like fucking, Ju-on style. Yo, these fucking ghosts, man!
If you stare at her long enough, she'll just turn around and go about her merry way. This moment honestly feels completely out of place, but I think that was intentional. It's the epitome of a cheap jump scare, followed by the realization that Lisa was being cheeky and screwing with you. Basically, this is Kojima having a giggle. There's one more type of encounter to be had with Lisa, and honestly, it might be one of the most terrifying things I've ever seen in a video game. The encounter I'm referring to, of course, is the possession. Should the player find themselves within the loops of the Hell puzzle or the truth sequence for too long of a time, this encounter can be triggered. You'll find Lisa approaching you very slowly from a certain position in the corridor, either the foyer, bathroom, or towards the previous loop door. She walks with a limp, and her head shakes and spasms violently as she gets closer. She'll actually only go a certain number of steps, and should the player exceed her pathing, she'll simply stop and stare at the player until finally disappearing moments later. What makes this encounter so terrifying, though, is how it seems to happen at random, meaning it's quite possible the player won't even realize what's going on, and depending on how it happened, this could lead to a number of potential results. For me, one of the most terrifying moments in PT was once during the truth sequence when I stumbled across her by accident. What's important to note here is that during the truth sequence, there is no source of light other than that of your flashlight and the digital clock. It's extremely dark, so you can barely see what's going on in front of you. Now, imagine the goosebumps I got when I was approaching the foyer only to see Lisa approaching me from the darkness. In an instant, I went from being relatively calm to jumping out of my seat. But much like the glass-shattering jump scare from the prior loop, there was this immediate tension as I wasn't close enough for her to possess me. So she was just walking towards me slowly and, as you can imagine, I decided to turn tail. Of course, the only way I had to go was back, so I made my way back to the prior loop door and had nowhere to go. Remember when I said Lisa will eventually stop and disappear? At this point, I hadn't got the memo, so I just stood there for a while in what I could only describe as
PP Pan City.
This scared the absolute hell out of me. But that's only one way in which this could potentially go, due to the seeming randomness of the encounter. Upon being possessed by Lisa, the player will now hear moaning and breathing similarly to how I described it earlier when walking past her during your first initial encounter. If you're wearing a headset, it'll sound as if Lisa is literally in your head. an almost uncomfortably invasive feeling that leaves the player with some serious goosebumps. On top of this, there is now a distinct third footstep that can be heard when walking. This footstep will also match Lisa's high heel rather than the player's boots. While possessed, the player is at huge risk of being attacked by Lisa should they turn around, similarly to how she did it in the look behind you puzzle when seeing her shadow. This is basically the most danger the player can find themselves in, and the game does a great job at conveying that through its use of audio. Lisa breathing in your head is creepy enough, but there's something about that third footstep that's just weird. It's unnerving. Something else I found really fun about the truth sequence was this moment with Lisa in the bathroom. I remember reading on forums that the bathroom acts as a sort of safe room from Lisa that the player could wait in until the haunting is ended. Oh, how wrong you were, silly internet forums. As it turns out, there's a unique encounter that can be had with Lisa by looking in the mirror. This is the game's way of warning you not to try and hide in here because she can kill you, and eventually will if you stay in there for too long. The encounter in the mirror itself is really damn creepy also. As you can see, Lisa appears from behind the player, walking forward like she does when she's about to do a possession. However, if you try turning around, you won't see her. I don't think this will trigger an attack, but it's pretty damn creepy nonetheless. As Lisa approaches you in the mirror, she'll continue until finally touching the sink, at which point she'll disappear.
I almost saw him.
Yeah, we saw like his
Do I have to loop before I do this again?
I don't know! And also you have to do it when the ghost is...
Wait, hauntings.
She's coming back.
Come on. Is this where she's coming from?
It's gotta be.
It could be the radio.
Okay, the haunting sounds on this one are more intense.
They are?
Haunting sounds intensify.
Yeah.
What's that flickering?
Nothing, I don't see it. Oh, it's just the what?
Oh! Go fuck you, man!
I'm staying here.
Fuck you!
Oh shit!
That's the worst!
Yeah, I beat him!
Oh!
My big manly dick beat your ghost.
I honestly can't think of another enemy in a video game that even comes close to replicating what made Lisa so threatening. Although the player has no means of defense against her, that doesn't mean she's going to completely halt anyone's progress. In PT, progress is generally tied to the player's ability to figure out the puzzle. Lisa is there for no other reason than to scare the absolute hell out of you. I suppose whether or not she succeeds at this is ultimately subjective, but given everything I've discussed up to this point, I'd say the game does a fantastic job at enabling her to do just that. On top of just being a fantastic enemy/antagonist of sorts, Lisa is an immensely compelling character. Given the tragic nature of her murder and the complicated circumstances surrounding it that we'll never have concrete answers for, the amount of conversations to be had about this character is honestly damn near endless. For a one-off teaser with supposedly nothing to do with the final product, what we got is surprisingly complex, and genuinely fascinating to discuss. There are story-driven games with multiple years of development that fail to come even close to this level of engagement. It's honestly unbelievable just how much there is to talk about PT 5 years removed from its initial release on the PlayStation Store. But I suppose I should hold off on that for the concluding piece. So here we are. All that's left to do is celebrate the legacy of PT and lament my eternal sorrows that it was taken before its time. There's only one more video following this, and I just want to thank you all so very much for the support and making it this far if you have. I've enjoyed the absolute hell out of this project, and I think I've actually decided on what I'll be doing going forward from here. In fact, I'm eager to make those announcements, but that'll have to wait for the next video. For now, my name is Loveless, and that was Lisa. Hello everyone and welcome back to my dissection of PT Silent Hills. Tonight will be the finale of this discussion, and I must admit I'm feeling a sort of bittersweet joy in writing this. Writing this script and editing these videos has been something of an adventure for me, in more ways than some of you will ever know, but I suppose that discussion is for another time. For now, let's reminisce about the terror that is PT Silent Hills. PT is a game unlike any other, something I hope I've convinced you of by this point in the series, and the impact it left on the gaming community is something that I hope people like-minded to myself will ensure is never forgotten. PT is a product of its time that will serve as a very important reminder of the countless issues facing AAA game development, a problem that still seems to be quite prevalent 6 years removed from the launch of PT. PT had everything going for it, with other classic horror titles like Resident Evil still facing something of an identity crisis, and more recent to the time franchises being watered down by greedy publishers. Gamers everywhere were craving to see either a return to form or a fresh but necessary take on a known horror title. Norman Reedus fans were eager to see the renowned actor take on the leading role in a video game that wasn't a terrible Walking Dead spin-off. Del Toro and Junji Ito fans would no doubt love to see how their respective artistic visions would translate into the world of gaming, and of course, Kojima fans were eager to see his next big project in the making. It's been said before, but I'll reiterate, even if Silent Hills was a complete and utter shit show of a game, it would have sold by the millions. PT was evidence enough of that, so why Konami would choose to let it go, as they did, is a truly baffling decision no matter how you look at it. Given what PT was able to provide, though, I honestly doubt the game would have been a failure. PT's terror was unlike anything we'd seen in a video game up to that point, although you'd be forgiven for thinking it looked like a typical first-person indie horror game of the time at first glance. Unfortunately, it didn't matter though, as Konami executives ultimately canceled the project and cut ties with Kojima, Del Toro, and Norman Reedus. From Konami's perspective, Hideo Kojima, regardless of his success, was an extremely expensive asset. Time is money, as they say, and Kojima's products took a very long time to develop. One of the reasons we know so little about PT is because it was so early on in development that how it would play hadn't even been decided upon. The Fox engine was extremely complex, requiring programmers to spend a great deal of time learning how to use it before even being able to proceed with development. On top of that, the engine itself was apparently quite expensive to develop for. At this point in the company's history, Konami was looking to focus in more on the mobile games market, where they could spend very little time, effort, and most of all money on smaller projects that were capable of raking in millions on a regular basis through microtransactions. Compare this to a AAA video game which took years and millions of dollars to develop, which would really only see one major return in the initial sales, and you can probably see where Konami executives would have decided that Kojima had become more trouble than he was worth. Now let me be clear, I do not side with this perspective at all. I'm only explaining it in the spirit of fairness. Frankly, the initial sales would have more than made up for the cost of development, given just how excited people were for this game. Canceling Silent Hills was always going to see some backlash, but had Konami let Kojima go prior to the conception of Silent Hills, had the Phantom Pain been marketed as Kojima's last hurrah at Konami, I don't think gamers around the world would have grown to despise the company as much as they did. Unfortunately, however, that's not what happened. Konami executives were certainly in a tight spot, but had they stopped at canceling Silent Hills and allowed Kojima to actually finish the Phantom Pain, I think things would have gone much more smoothly. For some reason or another, though, Konami would proceed to make a string of bad decisions that would permanently affect how their company was seen by consumers, at least for the foreseeable future. Following the cancellation of Silent Hills, PT was removed from the PlayStation Store, Kojima was forbidden by Konami from appearing at the Video Game Awards in celebration of the Phantom Pain, which I will remind you was Kojima's last game under the Konami brand.
Thank you very much, Kiefer, for accepting that award. And as you noticed, Hideo Kojima is not here with us tonight, and I want to tell you a little bit about that. Mr. Kojima had every intention of being with us tonight, but unfortunately he was informed by a lawyer representing Konami just recently that he would not be allowed to travel to tonight's awards ceremony to accept any awards. He's still under an employment contract, and it's disappointing, and it's inconceivable to me that an artist like Hideo would not be allowed to come here and celebrate with his peers and his fellow teammates such an incredible game as Metal Gear Solid 5. But that's the situation we're in. Hideo, is in Tokyo right now watching the show. So we want you to know, Hideo, that we're thinking of you. And we miss you. We hope to see you at the Game Awards 2016.
And finally, they moved forward with development on Metal Gear Survive, the first Metal Gear title not to be developed under its original creator, and ultimately a game that would prove to be less than successful, to put it lightly.
Now maybe giving it a 2 is a little bit too harsh, but when there's no fun to be had, when there's no reason to grind, when there's no reason to do anything, if I had 0 fun and I didn't even want to touch the game, why should it get a higher score? It gets a 2 and not a 1 because it works. The game functions, which is rare in today's day and age, so it gets a point for that. But it's just so bland and meaningless, and I can put up with a lot of trash when it comes to video games, man. I mean, I played Destiny for 3 years, I got all 6,000 gamer score in the Master Chief Collection, and I've done a whole hell of a lot more than that. But I just couldn't keep playing this game, which is kind of why this video is also a bit late, since I had to actively force myself to trudge through this thing. I honestly don't see how anybody could give this game a higher score than, say, a 4 out of 10. It's just the most subpar experience I've suffered through in a really long time.
Holy shit, this game is bad. Screw this game forever. Honestly, I never do this, but if you could really help me out and share this video somewhere, because I really just kind of want to spread the word about how awful this game is. Even if you don't end up posting this on like Reddit or forums, at least tell people that this game is so legendarily awful. Metal Gear Survive deserves to flop, and I want to do my own small part in making sure that nobody buys it. Maybe if this does bad enough, they'll finally sell the Metal Gear name to somebody who actually gives a crap. Metal Gear Survive is a chore to play. It's not only a slap in the face to Kojima, but a failure on its own terms.
So sharpen that pipe and jump into that wormhole for a game that's somehow both better than you thought it would be, and still terrible at the same time. But hey, if it does have anything going for it, at least it's one of a kind. Because it's definitely not getting a sequel.
The Metal Gear Survive reaches the dizzy heights of occasionally not boring. Nice work, Konami. Who needs Silent Hill when your business strategy can make me scared, miserable, and occasionally covered in bloodstained filth?
Yeah, screw this. I am done. The final verdict for Metal Gear Survive is a 2! A 2 out of 10! And it earns my epic fail seal for being a f***ing chore to play.
Combine all of these horrible decisions with the general lack of communication with the fans, all but refusing to discuss anything regarding Kojima or Silent Hill, and you can see how it would cause a great deal of frustration for the consumers. This series of frustratingly tone-deaf decisions and the frequent mistreatment of its employees had become the breaking point for many, including the most devoted of longtime fans of the company. Just as Kojima had captivated millions with his brilliant marketing stunt in one fell swoop, Konami had managed to become one of the most despised companies in the gaming industry within a matter of months. With all that said, I would like to make it clear that I'm not trying to make out everyone at Konami to be some kind of scumbag. Many employees at the company have made it clear to the public that there are many within the company that, upon seeing the massive outpour of support for Silent Hills, felt a renewed interest in making high-quality story-driven games. PT not only struck a chord with its audience, it managed to ignite a creative spark in numerous creators throughout the gaming industry, from the independent to the AAA. That alone is something worth celebrating. But alas, here we are. It's honestly a tragedy. That probably sounds hyperbolic, but PT was such a one-of-a-kind experience and there was so much potential in the Silent Hills project that its cancellation is, at least to me, a colossal failure on the part of Konami executives and a glaring reflection of the issues facing AAA game development. Since I've started writing this script, rumors of a new Silent Hill title have began circulating. This is nothing new, of course. There's been speculation from the day that PT was given the axe, but lately the rumors have really been going nuts. Pyramid Head, Cheryl Mason, Lisa Garland, and Sybil Bennett from Silent Hills 1, 2, and 3 have all been added to the game Dead by Daylight. On top of that, the next generation of consoles is right around the corner, so many players are assuming that Konami must be working on, or at the very least pondering, a new Silent Hill game. This of course raises a number of questions. What type of game would this Silent Hill title even be? Would it be a successor to PT? Are they going to remake one of the originals similar to what Capcom's been doing with Resident Evil? Are we going to see an entirely new game in the vein of Resident Evil 7? Silent Hill Battle Royale Pachinko? Who knows? There's almost nothing to go on at the moment. There have been rumors that the next game in the series will feature a companion app that will send messages to your phone in the real world. Cool idea, sounds almost like a Kojima thing to do. Also, no. If there is a new Silent Hill game currently in development, shot in the dark here, I don't think Kojima's involved. And no, Kojima isn't buying the Silent Hill license from Konami. Even he doesn't have that kind of money. I mean, okay, I guess I can't say that for absolute certainty, but I'm pretty confident. Not to ruin anyone's fun or rain on anyone's parade, but let's try and manage our expectations for what's to come. No doubt, PT's fantastic, but I'm also skeptical of what's to come given all that's happened since then. I know in the world of gaming that half a decade can feel like an incredibly long time, and with that time can come a renewed interest and even hope for the future, but let me remind you that this is Konami. Unless we're talking about Yu-Gi-Oh!, they've had a pretty spotty track record since even prior to Kojima's departure from the company. So given what I've said, you might be wondering what I'd like to see in the next Silent Hill. I don't want to dilute this video into a top 10 list or anything, but there are definitely a few things I'd like to see were we to venture back into that little town. The way I see it, there are two ways that the next game is likely to go. Of course, I could be completely wrong, but given the current state of the franchise, these two options feel the most appropriate, and most importantly, one of them is the safest bet at reigniting everybody's interest in the franchise. The first and most obvious is a remake of one of the original Silent Hill games. This is pretty obvious as an option, but I'd like to explore it a little bit more. If Konami were to release a new Silent Hill game, their first priority would have to be to remind people why they love the franchise as much as they do, whilst also making what epitomizes the franchise more easily accessible to the newer generations of players. As it stands, Silent Hill games are not easy to get a hold of, at least not the good ones. Unless you're alright with settling on a broken mess of an HD collection, containing only half of the originals, which, if I'm being honest, is probably for the best, or going the route of emulating, which has its own set of shortcomings, the only way you're going to be playing the original Silent Hill games is by tracking down copies of them from sellers on the internet. This, of course, comes with its own share of issues. Quality of deliveries can vary, prices can range from the obviously scamming to the utterly insane, and odds are not everyone is going to be familiar with every version of whichever game it is they're searching for. How many casual Silent Hill fans know the differences between the original and the greatest hits version of Silent Hill 2? I suppose if all else fails, you could get lucky and stumble across one at a flea market or a yard sale, but yeah, you understand what I'm getting at. And don't even get me started on how difficult it is for anyone without a PS4 to play PT. There have been some genuine and well-meaning attempts to preserve it across the internet, ranging from an Unreal Engine remake to someone recreating PT in Dreams, and while I'm certainly not about to take shots at these replicants, primarily since I haven't even played them myself, there are clear discrepancies between these fan projects and the genuine article that is the original PT demo. The point is, Silent Hill has been kept alive by its player base. When newcomers to the franchise hear about it, what they hear is more than likely coming from someone who grew up with the original 4. Meaning, whatever understanding they grow to have about the franchise will more than likely pertain to what elevated the originals above so many other games of their time. Weird occult plots, psychological horror, terrifying monster designs, fog, Pyramid Head. Dead by Daylight's most recent expansion should be evidence enough that when people think about Silent Hill, the originals are their go-to. So given how difficult it is for the players to get a hold of the original games, and given our understanding of where players' interests most likely are resting at this point, it makes complete sense to capitalize on all of that with the remake akin to what we've seen in the most recent Resident Evil games. Were the crew from Team Silent to be involved in the project, it would be all but guaranteed that the game would be faithful to the source material. So which game should be remade first? This might seem like a bizarre question, but Silent Hill 1 and 2 respectively have grown quite the following over the years. Silent Hill was a landmark title, but Silent Hill 2 was a sequel unlike any other, and perhaps most importantly to Konami, it was the most popular. Silent Hill 2's popularity cannot be overstated, and I would honestly not be surprised at all if it was the first to receive a remake. It would be Konami's safest bet for sure, and almost guaranteed to sell by the millions. This is all of course just my own speculation, and frankly, I would be excited to see either of them get remade, as long as it was of quality and there was promise that the other would receive its dues. If you all would like me to discuss in greater length what I would like to see in a Silent Hill remake, please feel free to let me know, but for now I feel as though I've said what I need to. So what about an all-new Silent Hill game? This is a tricky one, but I definitely think there are a few routes that could be taken here. The first and most obvious is a follow-up to PT, however this would not be a safe bet for Konami, as it would run the risk of being as poorly received by the fans as Metal Gear Survive was. I definitely think it would be in Konami's best interest to leave Kojima projects as they were. As it stands, the current set of rumors seem to be indicating something of a soft reboot for the franchise, which if I'm being honest, could mean anything from a remake to a recontextualization of the Silent Hill concept. Not entirely unlike what we got with Shattered Memories. Regardless of where the series goes, however, I'd fair to say that without most of the original Team Silent's involvement, the title just wouldn't land well enough for fans to guarantee its success. In fact, were we to discover that few or even none of them were involved, that would be a massive red flag for many. These guys know their stuff, and the dedication they've shown to their craft is something I feel as though cannot be overlooked. Not only in the original Silent Hill games, but in works that have followed such as Siren, No More Heroes, and Gravity Rush. Team Silent's work is practically gospel to any Silent Hill fan, and if Konami really does care about making a big hit, then Team Silent is the way to go. Put Keishiro Toyama or Kazuhide Nakazawa back in charge. Put Hiroyuki Owaku back in the writer's room. Let Masahiro Ito draw whatever gnarly abominations his mind can conceive, and damn it all, put Akira Yamaoka back in charge of all things sound design. And no doubt these guys would love to be involved. Their love for Silent Hill far exceeds anything a fan like myself could ever feel or convey. Nakayama was already involved in Kojima's planned Silent Hills, and we know that other members of Team Silent were assisting with the project, so I've no doubt that the majority of them would be more than willing to get back to work on a real Silent Hill project. So moving forward, specifically from the perspective of a developer on the next Silent Hill title, what is there to learn from PT? Well, there are a few things. I don't necessarily think the next Silent Hill title needs to be so inspired by Kojima that it plays with the fourth wall or is played from the first-person perspective. However, as I hopefully explained, that's not all that PT was. First and foremost, Japanese horror. I'm going to make a rather strong claim here, but I believe audiences have been craving a legitimate mainstream Japanese horror gaming experience for quite some time. I would think PT's success and legacy would be evidence enough of this, but in all fairness, it could be dismissed by many, particularly businessmen who want a product with guaranteed success, as an outlier. That is an unfortunate truth to the matter that I hate to admit, but there you have it. But, given the love people have for the originals and PT, I think it's undeniable that Japanese horror is where Silent Hill is at its strongest. Aside from that, I think a greater focus on puzzle solving rather than combat would make for a strong approach. Silent Hill will never be known for having good combat, and if a Silent Hill title were to become known for having solid combat, I'd almost be willing to guarantee it would be considered mediocre as a whole. That's not to say that I want poorly implemented combat, just that combat should not be the main focus of the experience. I'm not about to sit here and boneheadedly insist that combat be a garbage experience and that tank controls still be a thing in 2020. The combat should be serviceable and functional, but it shouldn't be this action and body-oriented experience where you're capable of doing sick combos or slaughtering monsters. If I want any of that, I'm gonna go play Devil May Cry, not Silent Hill. If I had one piece of advice for the developers of the next Silent Hill title, because I'm sure they're watching this video very keenly to hear what this rando on the internet has to say, it would be to find a gimmick that works and roll with it much in the same way Visceral did with the original Dead Space. That's not to say the next title needs to be an over-the-shoulder experience, although I wouldn't be opposed to it, or that it even needs to have as many combat scenarios as Dead Space, but that it would be perfectly serviceable and perhaps even great if the general combat focused on a gimmick that subverts conventional design and proceeded from there. Let's go into a brief hypothetical. Let's pretend for a moment, and if only for a moment, that PT was never cancelled and Kojima was working on Silent Hills as we speak. You know, because development for that takes 6 years, I guess. Now let's put ourselves in the developer's shoes for a moment and come up with a general gameplay format based on the success of the one enemy in PT, Lisa. Keeping in line with her design, the majority of enemies would manifest as intangible spirits that seek to torment the player. Instead of outright fighting these enemies, perhaps we would simply try to outsmart them or even outmaneuver them so as to gain the advantage. Perhaps the spirits can lift nearby weapons the player can also access, and attempt to use them on the player. Since the player can't attack the ghost, they instead can choose to destroy the weapon they're wielding, or if the player was feeling particularly crafty, they could try and bait the spirit into throwing the weapon or dropping it to do something else. That way the player can retrieve the item for themselves. As the game progresses, perhaps different enemy types find different uses for different weapons. This would force the player into having to really consider each encounter, whilst also allowing for a great number of surprises to be had throughout various scenarios. Perhaps one enemy could screw with a trap or some device that would cause the player trouble, and the only way to stop them is to disable the device. I want to inform you at this point that I am intentionally leaving this piece of the essay unedited, not because I think my idea is particularly good or anything like that, but because there's a very real potential for the next game to have perfectly serviceable combat without resorting to conventional mechanics, provided they find a gimmick, stick with it, and flesh it out as much as possible. My idea only really works as a follow-up to PT, at least within this context, but of course, there are many other, if not infinite, possible gameplay formats that the next game could take. So what if, for instance, the next title did turn out to be a remake of one of the originals? Well, in that case, I would simply suggest giving the game enough polishing to act as a serviceable recreation of the source material, and really there wouldn't be a need to go any further. Perhaps the implementation of ideas that they wanted to explore in the original but ultimately never could. Maybe even some added mechanics or new phases to spice up various boss battles. I suppose there are cues you could take from the Western titles, primarily on what not to do, but ultimately I think the focus needs to be on puzzles, and there's really no need to go any further with the combat as long as the combat isn't a broken, buggy mess that screws the player over in a way that's outright unfair. Of course, more polished combat is always nice, and I want to make it clear that I'm not one of those people who weirdly insist that combat be bad in a horror game, as if unreliable combat suddenly equates to a more tense experience. The fear should come from the monsters and situations, not from anxiety over whether or not the controls are going to work. My only desire is to see other facets of the game given higher priority, most notably what the games have come to be known for over the years, the horror and exploration puzzle-based gameplay. Silent Hill is a series I've held a great deal of love and respect for over the years. Silent Hill 1 through 4 are some of my favorite horror games of all time, and Silent Hill 2 is one of my favorite games of all time. These games tackled mature storytelling in a way that modern games are still failing to catch up to, and the quality of character writing is outstanding. Not only are the games scary, but they're compelling. Despite the obviously horrifying nature of the realm of Silent Hill, there's something oddly mystifying about it and the way it manages to manifest around its characters. The Western titles, while having their merits, failed both as horror games and as compelling stories. PT was the first time in ages we'd seen Silent Hill truly return to form, despite the obvious differences between it and the original titles. PT is a downright terrifying experience on both an aesthetic and psychological level. Its few characters are compelling, and we can infer a great deal about them despite being given so little. Not only did it work as a horror game, but it was a major turning point for the Silent Hill franchise. For the first time since the PS2 era, there was genuine excitement everywhere for the next big Silent Hill game. It had everything going for it. An incredibly talented development team consisting of several members of Team Silent, marketing that got players excited, a genuine approach to classic Japanese horror, endless clickbait potential. Silent Hills had it all. It's been said before, but even if this game was a complete and utter flop, it would have sold by the millions. Silent Hills may be gone, but it will live forever in the hearts of the players, such as myself, who became so encapsulated by the unending terror of that accursed L-shaped corridor. PT is a literal ghost of a video game, and it's up to the players to preserve its legacies as the years go on. That was my ultimate goal with this series. On top of generally just wanting to take a deep dive into a game I loved, I wanted to, in one way or another, make sure that I did my part in keeping this game's legacy alive. The future of Silent Hill is hazy enough, but what comes to be of PT is truly unknowable for the time being. So that about does it for my analysis of PT. This has been quite the adventure for me, and I feel an immense satisfaction in finally getting to this point where I can say I've reached the end. As you can probably tell, I love video games, and to talk about them and analyze them is a major passion of mine. Something I've been pondering for quite some time is what I plan to do after completing this series. I've been putting a lot of thought into it. Part of me really wants to stick to talking about horror games, but at the same time there are a lot of games that I really love that I want to start talking about in some way. And I've got an idea. The next title I'm going to be talking about is not a horror game. In fact, the next title I'm going to be talking about isn't even a full game.
You've heard of the Sierra Madre Casino. We all have. The legend, the curses, foolishness about it lying in the middle of the city of the dead. Buried beneath a blood-red cloud. A bright, shining monument luring treasure hunters to their doom. The world's most famous stars and entertainers were invited to its grand opening. An invitation was a sign of exclusiveness. The opening was supposed to symbolize a road to a brighter future, not just for the world, but for all who came to its doors. A chance for anyone to begin again. Except the Sierra Madre never opened. The war froze it in time, like a big flashbulb going off. The grand opening. One big ending of humanity. It's still out there, in the wastes, preserved, just waiting for someone to crack it open. But getting to it, that's not the hard part.
It's letting go.
It's letting go.
Fallout New Vegas, Dead Money. This one's going to be a bit different than my PT analysis series. For starters, this is going to be a full-fledged review, so this time when I start talking about the game's mechanics, story, etc., I'm going to be trying to arrive at a conclusion on the overall quality of it. I'm going to go ahead and warn you now, this series will be much longer than the PT series. Right now, and I'm only on the first draft, it's looking to be about 14 parts. However, the Dead Money review isn't all that I've got planned. I've got a few different video formats in mind that I want to try and play around with. The first, of course, being a review format that I want to try with Dead Money. The other is a critique. This won't be a video series so much as a single, probably quite long video, where I basically break down various different mechanics, storytelling aspects, and whatever else I can think of that really bring down a game. The critique videos will only be about games that I hate. So I'm going to be having a bit of fun with that. And hopefully some of you will enjoy getting to watch me go off on certain games that you might hate as well. I don't want to completely spoil what the critique's going to be, but I also kind of do. So what I'm going to do is tell you all 3 games that I currently have critique videos planned for, and then I'm going to leave you all to wonder what's to come. First, there's Dead Space 3, which some of you may know that I've already talked about just a little bit. Then there's DMC Devil May Cry, the reboot to one of my favorite franchises of all time. And finally, the sequel to one of my favorite games of all time, the sequel that everyone loves so much, The Last of Us Part 2. That's going to be a fun one. You can expect to see the next video out probably around mid-December. The thing about me is that I like to get my scripts completely done before I start doing any amount of video editing. That way I go in knowing exactly what I want. I'm a decent ways through the script of the Dead Money review, and I've drafted pretty much the entirety of my first critique. Again, this is going to take me some time. I just really want to make sure that these videos are as good as possible, and that I go into as much depth as possible. On top of that, I also have to gather video footage. And for the Dead Money review, I'm doing multiple playthroughs on multiple different characters, both on standard and hardcore mode, so that's gonna take me a little bit of time. Time that might be expanded a little bit more than it would have been had the PlayStation 5 not be releasing in less than a week. So yeah, I've got kind of a full plate here. I'm doing my best, I promise, just be a little bit patient with me. There are more videos coming though, that much I can promise. But for now, I suppose it's time that I bid you all adieu. Thank you very much for joining me on this journey through PT. I will see you all again soon. Thanks for watching.